Clara Whitmore slammed the iron pot down so hard, the tin plates rattled off the chuck wagon's shelf and hit the dirt. "I don't need your pity," she said, chest-heaving voice cracking like dry wood under a boot. "I need this job." The cattle company foreman stared at her worn dress, at her thick arms, at the raw grief sitting in the hollows under her eyes, and almost laughed. She was 20 years old, 6 months a widow, and the only thing standing between her and starvation was this man's answer. If this story is already pulling at your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Clara Whitmore had not cried since the morning they lowered her husband into the ground. She had stood at that graveside in her best dress, the pale blue one James had always said made her look like Sunday, and she had kept her chin lifted because crying in front of the townspeople of Harding, Texas, felt like giving them exactly what they wanted. Something to talk about, something to shake their heads over and carry back to their supper tables. She had not given them that. But alone in the farmhouse that night, with James's boots still sitting beside the door where he'd left them, and his coffee mug still unwashed on the table, because she couldn't bring herself to touch it, she had folded down to the kitchen floor and pressed her face against her knees and made sounds she didn't recognize as her own voice. That had been 6 months ago. Now she stood in front of Warren Dodd, the stout, red-faced foreman for the Caldwell Cattle Company, and she did not allow a single tremor to show in her jaw. "You understand what this job is, ma'am," Dodd said, squinting at her the way a man squints at a horse he suspects is lame before he bids on it. "It ain't wash day cooking, ain't Sunday supper. We're talking 25 men 3 months on the trail, sunup to past sundown every single day. You'd be on that wagon before the roosters start hollering, and you wouldn't be off it until the stars come out." "I understand," Clara said. "You ever cooked over an open fire, not a stove, a fire, in wind, in rain, when the wood is wet and the men are half out of their minds with hunger and they don't care nothing about your troubles?" "I have." Dodd scratched under his hat brim. His eyes moved over her in a way she'd grown entirely too accustomed to, the slow appraising look that started at her face and worked its way down and came to a conclusion before he'd asked her a single question worth answering. "You're a big woman," he said, as though she might not have been aware of this fact. "I'm a strong woman," Clara said. "There's a difference." He blinked. Men like Dodd didn't expect to be corrected, especially not by widows in worn dresses who'd come asking for work. "The pay is $12 a month," he said, recovering himself. "Trail cooks got to keep up with the drive. If you fall behind, we don't wait." "I won't fall behind." He looked at her, another long moment. Then he let out a breath through his nose, not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh, and said, "All right, Mrs. Whitmore, you start Monday." Clara walked back through town with the contract folded inside her dress pocket, and she did not let herself feel anything until she was well past the last building on the main street and onto the open road where nobody could see her face. Then she pressed one hand flat against her sternum and breathed. $12 a month, 3 months on the trail, $36 total if she made it. Enough to keep the farmhouse, enough to survive the winter, enough to exist in this world without depending on the charity of people who had already made very clear they did not particularly wish to extend it. She had not expected Harding to be cruel after James died. She had expected people to be awkward. Grief made people awkward. She understood that. They didn't know what to say to a young widow, so they said too little, or they said the wrong things, or they looked at their boots and mumbled condolences that were over before they'd properly begun. That she could have forgiven. What she could not forgive. What she filed quietly away behind her sternum and never spoke aloud was the other thing. The particular cruelty that came dressed up in concern. It started the week after the funeral. Margaret Ellison, who ran the dry goods store and considered herself the moral authority of the entire county, stopped Clara on the boardwalk and held both her hands and looked at her with that specific expression, lips pressed together, head tilted, eyes filled with a manufactured sympathy that Clara had come to recognize as its own kind of violence. "Oh, you poor dear," Margaret had said. "You've had such a hard start, married so young, and now this." A pause. "Of course James was always such a kind boy. I imagine he married you because he had a generous heart." The implication sat between them like a stone in still water. James had married her out of generosity, out of pity. Because what man would have chosen Clara Whitmore, wide-hipped, full-figured Clara Whitmore, who'd grown up too big and too plain and too much of everything? The world told women not to be out of actual desire. Clara had smiled and thanked her for her condolences. And she had gone home and stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. That was the first one. The others followed. Men at the feed store, who stopped talking when she walked in and started again the moment she left. Voices lower and followed by short, mean laughter. Women at the church social who invited her out of obligation and spoke around her all evening like she was a piece of furniture that had wandered into the room. The widower across the county, Hector Mills, old enough to be her grandfather, who came to call 3 weeks after the funeral, hat in hand, suggesting with remarkable cheerfulness that perhaps they might come to some arrangement, as he needed someone to cook and clean, and she needed a roof over her head, and beggars can't be choosers now, can they? She'd closed the door on Hector Mills with a softness that had cost her every ounce of self-control she possessed. And she had stood in the farmhouse kitchen in the quiet, that terrible quiet that had moved in the day. James died and hadn't left, and she had thought about what was left. The house. 6 months of payments still owed on it. The land. Dry. Not enough to farm on her own. Her savings. Almost gone. And her body, which the world had spent 20 years telling her was the wrong shape, the wrong size, the wrong everything, and which she had spent 20 years quietly refusing to be ashamed of, even when the shame crept up on her in the small hours of the night when there was no one watching and she was too tired to hold her defenses up. She was not going to beg. She was not going to marry Hector Mills or anyone like him. She was going to work. The Caldwell Cattle Company, chuck wagon, was a battered, magnificent thing. A deep wooden box on wheels packed with flour sacks and salt pork and dried beans and coffee cans and cast-iron skillets and Dutch ovens and a water barrel bolted to the side that had to be refilled at every creek crossing. There was a swing-out table on the back that dropped down for prep work, and a boot below it for storing wood and kindling. It was, Clara recognized immediately, the most complicated kitchen she'd ever worked in. And the most liberating. Because out here nobody expected her to be anything except competent. Nobody was watching her figure when she was bent double over a fire at 4 in the morning. Nobody was making calculations about her marriageability when she was hauling water. The cowboys barely looked at her at all. The first few days she was background furniture, part of the machinery of the drive. A function rather than a person. They called her Cookie. Not Mrs. Whitmore, not Clara, not even Ma'am half the time. Cookie. She had decided privately that she did not mind. There was something almost restful about being reduced to a single purpose. Something clean about knowing exactly what was expected of you and delivering it every morning, every evening, without needing to perform anything else. She woke before anyone. She had the coffee on before the sky turned gray. She had biscuits in the Dutch oven and salt pork frying before the cowhands dragged themselves out of their bedrolls, and she had breakfast laid out and waiting before the sun broke the horizon. The men ate. They didn't say much. They put their plates in the rec pan and headed for their horses, and the drive resumed. Then Clara packed up, drove the wagon ahead on the side trail to the next stopping point, and started the whole cycle again. It was hard. It was relentless. It was exactly what she needed. She first noticed Thomas Caldwell on the 4th day out of Harding. She didn't know his name yet. She knew him only as the man who rode back to check on the wagon more consistently than she'd expected a trail boss to do. Most mornings he appeared briefly on the north side of the herd, a dark shape against the early sky, and the other riders gave him a wide berth that told her everything she needed to know about the kind of authority he carried. How was tall on horseback? Not showy about it. Not the kind of tall that performed itself, but the kind that just existed quietly. Like a fence post that had been there long enough, the earth had settled around it. He had a stillness about him, even in motion, and dark eyes that when they swept across the camp, didn't miss anything. The first time those eyes landed on her directly, Clara was in the middle of an argument. Young Pete Ferris, 19 years old, all lanky limbs and too much confidence, had decided that breakfast wasn't to his taste. "Biscuits are hard," he announced, holding one up like evidence at a trial. Clara was loading the wreck pan and did not look up. They'll soften when you stop complaining about them and put them in your mouth. A ripple of surprised laughter from the men nearby. Pete's ears went red. I'm just saying, back home, my mama made biscuits you could actually bite through. Your mama's cooking on a wood stove with 2 hours of prep time, Clara said, still not looking up. I'm cooking on open ground with wet kindling and wind coming in from the northwest at 40 miles an hour. When you build me a wood stove out here on the Texas plain, Pete, I will make you biscuits that'll bring tears to your eyes. Until then, eat what's in front of you and be grateful something warm is in front of you at all. Pete opened his mouth, then closed it. Old Bill, a weathered drover who'd been on cattle drives since before Pete Ferris was born, clapped the boy on the shoulder. Boy, don't argue with the cook. That's the first rule of the trail, and the last one any man forgets. It was then that Clara became aware of the stillness at the edge of the camp. She looked up. Thomas Caldwell was sitting his horse about 15 feet away, and he was watching her. Not with the appraising, dismissive look she'd become accustomed to. Not with amusement exactly, though there was something in the set of his mouth that might have been the ghost of it. He was watching her the way a man watches something he's trying to understand. When her eyes met his, he touched the brim of his hat. Just once. Brief, deliberate. Then he turned his horse and rode back to the herd. Clara held the moment for exactly 2 seconds, then went back to loading the wreck pan. She told herself it meant nothing. His name, she learned from Old Bill that evening, was Thomas Caldwell. He owned the cattle. He owned the company. He'd been running drives out of Montana for 12 years, and he had a reputation across 3 states for being the kind of trail boss who brought his herd in. Not always fast, not always without losses, but in. He'd driven through blizzards in the Dakotas, and flooded river crossings in Missouri, and a fever outbreak in Kansas that had put 6 of his men on their backs for 2 weeks. Never lost a drive, Old Bill said, chewing thoughtfully. Never lost a man on the trail neither. Some say that's luck. I rode with him 4 times now. I say that's something else. What's something else? Clara asked. Old Bill looked at her. He pays attention, he said simply. To everything, all the time. Most men leading a drive, their eyes are on the herd. Their job is the cattle. His eyes are on the cattle, and the men, and the weather, and the land, and the water, and the... He gestured vaguely at the whole of the surrounding world. Everything. Nothing gets by him. Clara thought about the way he'd been watching her that morning. She thought about how his eyes had moved across the camp. Not the way most men's eyes moved, grabbing at things, discarding them, but the way a man's eyes moved when he was building a picture in his head and intended to keep it. She told herself again that it meant nothing. She was the trail cook. She was background. She was function. She went to sleep with that thought firmly in place and woke up before dawn to prove it. She was 3 weeks into the drive when she first understood something about Thomas Caldwell that nobody had told her. He was lonely. Not in the loud, desperate way that some men were lonely, not the kind that filled silence with noise and showed their need like a wound. His loneliness was the quiet, settled kind. The kind that had been with a man long enough that he'd stopped fighting it and simply carried it around like a coat that no longer fit, but had nowhere else to go. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, not all at once, but in pieces that assembled themselves without her permission. The way he sat apart from the other men at the evening fire. Not unfriendly he spoke, he listened, he nodded, but always with a slight remove, a distance of 6 inches that might as well have been 6 miles. The way he read the same letter twice some nights. She'd seen him do it twice now, pull a folded paper from his breast pocket, read it, fold it again, put it back. His face didn't change while he read it. That was what told her it wasn't good news he was rereading. Good news men smiled at. This was something he was just holding. The way he said goodnight. Every night as the camp settled, he stood for a moment outside the firelight and looked north. Just looked. Like he was checking on something too far away to see. Clara was not a romantic. She had buried romanticism in the same grave as her husband, and she did not intend to dig it up again. But she was an observer. She had always been an observer. She'd found one of the gifts of being overlooked. When people didn't bother to perform for you, you saw who they actually were. She was beginning to see who Thomas Caldwell actually was. And that, she told herself firmly, was enough. That was all she needed to do with that information. Just see it. Set it down. Move on. She had biscuits to make. The trouble with Walt Greer started on a Tuesday. Greer was the second drover first among the cowboys in his own estimation, a position he maintained through a combination of physical size, loud opinions, and a talent for making other men feel smaller without ever quite crossing the line that would require someone to address it directly. He hadn't spoken to Clara much in the first weeks. She'd felt his eyes on her a few times in the way she was practiced at feeling the sideways look, the slow, contemptuous appraisal, but he'd kept himself to muttered comments to the men around him. Things said just below the threshold of what could be directly confronted. The Tuesday it changed was the day they made camp earlier than expected due to a lame horse. Time in camp was always the most dangerous kind of time for Clara. On the trail, everyone was too tired for anything but function. In the saddle, the work spoke for itself. It was the loose hours that created problems. She was kneading bread dough, her hands in up to the wrist, her whole weight going into it, the way you had to on a trail, because she didn't have the luxury of time to let it rise properly, and had to work the gluten hard to compensate when she heard Greer's voice behind her. Must take a lot of feed to keep a horse that size going. She kept kneading. I'm talking to you, Cookie. I heard you, Clara said without turning around. A beat. Then the sound of boots shifting in the dirt, men nearby going quiet. Might be the company's spending more feeding you than the actual cattle, Greer said. There was a smirk in his voice, the special mean pleasure of a man who'd found an audience and intended to use it. Clara stopped kneading. She set both palms flat on the dough. She took one measured breath. Then she turned around. Greer was standing with two younger cowboys on either side of him, not backing him up so much as having failed to walk away in time, which had the same effect. Clara looked at Greer. Just looked at him. She didn't drop her eyes, and she didn't change her expression, and she let the silence do its work for a full 5 seconds before she spoke. You're going to want to finish your thought, she said, or not. But you should know that you've got two choices here. You can keep going, and we can have whatever this is out in front of everyone, or you can turn around and go find something useful to do with yourself. I've got bread to make, and I don't particularly care which one you pick. But I will point out that if you make yourself into an enemy of the cook this far from Kansas, you're going to be finding your own supper for the next 2 months. Greer's jaw tightened. Now, Clara said, turning back to her dough. If you don't have anything else to contribute, I'd appreciate the quiet. She heard him stand there for another moment, heard the exact quality of the silence that told her he was deciding whether his pride was worth the cost. And then she heard boots retreating and the quiet exhale of the younger cowboys behind him. She kneaded the bread. Her hands were perfectly steady. She did not let them shake until she was absolutely certain no one was watching. That evening, Thomas materialized at the edge of the firelight in the way he had, like he'd been there longer than she'd noticed. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. She looked up from the pot she was tending. Mr. Caldwell. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, which meant he wasn't about to give an order. She'd learned his tells. Greer give you trouble today, he said. Nothing I couldn't handle. I know you handled it, he said. I'm asking if he gave you trouble. She held his gaze. He said something stupid. Men say stupid things. It's not particular to the trail. He was quiet for a moment. You shouldn't have to handle that alone. Mr. Caldwell, Clara said, and her voice was careful and even. I've been handling things alone for 6 months. I expect I'm getting rather good at it. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, attentive eyes. Then he said so quietly she almost missed it. That doesn't make it right. She didn't have an answer for that. She looked back at the pot. When she looked up again, he had gone. She found the coffee waiting for her the next morning. She was up before anyone, as always, pulling kindling together in the dark, and there it was, a tin cup sitting on the wagon's swing-out table with steam still rising off it. Someone had stoked a small fire ahead of her and set the coffee on and gone. She looked around. The camp was dark and quiet. She picked up the cup. The coffee was exactly as she drank it. Black with a half measure of sugar. She'd never told anyone that. She'd never thought anyone had noticed. She stood with the cup in both hands in the dark before sunrise, and drank it slowly, and she thought about a man with dark, careful eyes who paid attention to everything. She thought about it exactly as long as it took to finish the coffee. Then she set the cup down and got to work. On the 31st day, they crossed the Red River. It was a crossing she'd been warned about. The Red ran unpredictable wide and calm 1 week, running fast and chest deep the next, and getting a full herd of longhorns across it was organized chaos at its most controlled. Thomas stationed her wagon on the near bank until the crossing was complete, which she understood was practical. There was no point getting the supplies wet if the cattle spooked, and she stood on the wagon seat and watched the drive unfold. He was something to see managing a crossing. She hadn't known that about him. She'd seen him ride, seen him handle individual situations, but this was different. He was everywhere at once, on the right flank, then the left, then back to the center, to redirect a steer that was pulling the wrong way. His horse responding to pressure from his knees, that Clara could barely see, the two of them moving like a single fluid thing. The cowboys called back and forth, and he was always 2 steps ahead of whatever they were saying, already moving to address a problem before it became one. The herd moved in a shape he'd clearly calculated how the lead steers would hit the current, how the momentum of the rear would carry through where the natural drift would pull, and how to account for it. She'd never seen anyone do anything with that particular combination of knowledge and instinct. The way he held both at once. When the last steer cleared the far bank, a sound went up from the cowboys. Not quite a cheer, but close, the sound of men releasing breath they'd been holding, and Thomas turned his horse in the shallows and looked back across the river. He found the wagon with his eyes immediately. Found her. He didn't do anything. Didn't wave, didn't call across the water. Just looked for a moment with an expression she couldn't read at this distance. She raised one hand. A simple acknowledgement. I saw it. I saw you. He turned his horse. The drive moved on. Clara sat down on the wagon seat and picked up the reins, and was aware with a clarity that was both unwelcome and entirely precise that she was in significant trouble. She had not come on this drive to feel things. She had come to survive, to earn money, to prove to herself and to the townspeople of Harding, Texas, that she was capable of existing in this world on her own terms, without help, without pity, and without anyone's permission. She had not come here to notice the way a man's hands moved when he was thinking through a problem, or the way he stood at the edge of the firelight in the evenings and looked north at something she couldn't see, or the way he'd said "that doesn't make it right" in a voice so quiet it had moved through her like weather. Thomas Caldwell was a trail boss. He was her employer. He was 12 years older than her, and from a different state, and almost certainly from a different world, and whatever she'd seen passing between them in glances and small gestures and a cup of coffee left before dawn. Whatever that was it was not a thing she was going to build a story around. She had built a story once. She had built it around James Whitmore when she was 18, and he was 22, and they were standing at the edge of a hayfield in October, and he had looked at her with an expression that made her feel for the first time in her life like her size was not the most interesting thing about her. She had built that story, and it had been real, and she had loved him. And then, in the space of 3 weeks, a fever had taken him, and the story was over, and she was left in the ruins of a life she'd barely begun, with nobody to blame, and nothing to hold, and the cold, bare fact of her own existence to deal with. She was not building another story. She was making biscuits. She was driving a chuck wagon across the Texas plain. She was doing her job. Cookie. She was watering the mule at a creek crossing, bucket in hand, and she heard the name but didn't place it as directed at her until she heard it again, softer and lower than before. Clara. She turned. Thomas was standing at the edge of the water, holding his horse's reins. Watching her with a directness that she was discovering the quality of something that could not be accidental. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, startled in spite of herself by the use of her given name, which no one on this drive had used since the morning she'd arrived. "I owe you an apology," he said. She blinked. That was not what she had been expecting. For what? Greer. I told you. I know what you told me, he said. And I know you handled it. But a trail boss is responsible for what happens in his camp. Mrs. Whitmore, and what Greer said to you shouldn't have happened. I should have made it clear from the beginning that the cook is not... He started again. You're not hired labor that men can speak to any way they please. You are the reason 25 men are fed and functional on this drive, and you deserve to be treated accordingly. Clara was quiet for a moment. You spoke to him, she said. It wasn't a question. This morning, Thomas said simply. Greer won't be a problem again. She looked at him. The creek ran quietly beside them. The mule pulled at the bucket. Why? She said. He looked at her with those direct, careful eyes. Why what? Why does it matter to you I'm the cook? I handled it. A lot of men in your position would consider that the end of it. He was quiet for a long moment. Because it matters, he said. And then very quietly. And because you're not just the cook. Whatever else you might think about that. He touched the brim of his hat, that brief deliberate gesture she'd come to recognize as his version of punctuation, and led his horse back up the bank. Clara stood at the creek with the empty bucket in her hand, and the water running over the stones, and the afternoon light coming gold through the grass overhead. She told herself nothing. She picked up the bucket and went back to the wagon. But that night, for the first time since James, she fell asleep without the silence, feeling like something she had to survive. And she didn't know what to do with that. Not yet. She woke up the next morning with that thought still sitting quietly in the back of her mind, the way a new sound in a house sits noticed, unexplained, not yet alarming. She didn't examine it. She got up. She started the fire. She made the coffee. That was the shape of her days now, and she had come to understand that the shape of her days was what kept everything else in its proper place. As long as her hands were moving, as long as there was something that needed doing, the quieter and more dangerous parts of her interior life stayed where she'd put them. She was measuring flour into the bowl when old Bill appeared at her elbow with his cup out the way he did every morning, reliable as sunrise. Sleep all right? He asked. Fine, she said. You don't look fine. Bill, she said, I'm 20 years old and I've been cooking for 25 men on an open plain for a month. I don't think I'm supposed to look fine. He chuckled a low, comfortable sound and poured his own coffee from the pot, because he was one of the few men on the drive who'd figured out early that asking Cookie to pour your coffee was how you ended up doing it yourself anyway. You hear about Greer, he said carefully, the way a man says something he already knows the answer to. I heard, she said. Caldwell had a word with him last night after supper. Don't know exactly what was said, but Greer was quiet as a stone this morning, which is not a condition that comes naturally to that particular man. Clara kept measuring. Most trail bosses wouldn't bother, Bill said. Cook's not their problem unless the food runs out. I know, she said. Just thought you should know he bothered. She looked at him then. Bill's face was weathered past the point where expressions were easy to read, but she'd been watching him for a month, and she could see the thing underneath the neutral tone. Not quite a warning, not quite encouragement, something suspended carefully between the two. I know, she said again, quieter. Bill nodded, sipped his coffee, said nothing else about it. The drive moved on. Greer was as promised a stone. He came to meals and ate and returned his plate without a word, and when his eyes passed over Clara, they moved with the careful blankness of a man who had received instruction and intended to follow it. Not because he'd changed his mind about anything she could see that well enough, but because whatever Thomas had said to him had landed with sufficient weight to hold. That weight she was discovering was something Thomas carried without performing it. He didn't need to raise his voice. She'd never heard him raise his voice. He had a particular register he used when he meant something, absolutely a drop in tone, a slowing of speech, a directness that left no air in the sentence for argument to grow in, and the men around him responded to it, the way horses responded to a still certain hand on the reins. They moved. They stopped. They followed. She was thinking about this on the 35th day, stirring a pot of beans that didn't require her full attention, when she became aware that Thomas had been standing nearby for longer than he usually stood in one place. She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at something she couldn't see, some middle distance past the edge of the camp, with an expression that sat differently on his face than his usual focused attention. There was something in it that looked, she thought, like tiredness. Not the physical kind, the other kind. "You want coffee?" she said. He looked at her. "What?" "You've been standing there like a man who needs coffee," she said. "There's some left in the pot." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." She poured it and held it out. He came and took it, and she noticed not for the first time that he was always careful not to put her in a position where she had to come to him. He always came to where she was. She'd been cataloging these things without meaning to. He stood beside the wagon with the cup, not speaking. She went back to her beans. "My daughter's birthday is tomorrow," he said. She looked up. He was still looking at that middle distance. "How old will she be?" Clara asked. 7, he said. "She'll be 7 years old tomorrow, and I'll be somewhere in the middle of Texas, and the last time I saw her, she was trying to tell me she was old enough to have her own horse." A pause. "She's not. But she's going to need someone who can explain that to her without making her feel like the wanting was wrong." Clara didn't say anything right away. She understood this was not a thing that needed a response so much as a space to exist in. "She have someone looking after her," she said after a moment. "While you're away." "My sister," he said. "Martha. She's good with them. Lily and Ethan both." He stopped. "Ethan's 10. He's got his mother's temper and my tendency to go silent when something's wrong, which is a combination that makes him very hard to reach when he's hurting." She turned to look at him, then directly. "His mother," she said carefully. Thomas looked down at the cup. "She died 3 years ago. Fever. Same as your husband, I imagine. Pneumonia," Clara said. "For James." "Same for Helen," he said. 3 weeks from fine to gone. Both children were there. That's the part I can't—" He stopped, set his jaw. "That's the part they're still carrying." The fire snapped. "You carry it too," Clara said. Not a question. He looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she'd seen on his face since the drive began. "Every day," he said simply. "Every single day." They stood in the quiet that followed, and it was a different kind of quiet than the silences that usually fell between them. Not the careful space of two people who were still figuring out what the other was, but something closer and more honest. The kind of quiet that can only happen after something true has been said. "Her name was Helen," Clara said finally. "Yes." "And your daughter is Lily." "Lily Grace," he said. "She has Helen's hair. I keep expecting that to get easier." Clara looked at him steadily. "It doesn't get easier," she said. "But it changes shape. The weight is the same, but you get stronger. At some point you realize you've been carrying it for long enough that you can carry it and walk at the same time." He looked at her for a long moment. "You figured that out in 6 months," he said, and his voice was not skeptical. It was something closer to wondering. "I figured it out in 6 months on a cattle drive," she said. "I had good motivation." The ghost of a smile moved across his face. It was brief, and then it was gone, but she felt it the way you feel a match being struck in a dark room. The quality of the air changed for a moment. "Happy birthday to Lily Grace," she said. "Tell her when you get home that someone on the trail was thinking about her." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he tipped the brim of his hat and said, "I'll do that," and walked back toward the herd. Clara stared at her beans. She acknowledged privately, and with no small amount of resignation, in a great deal of trouble. The trouble she was in had a very specific shape. It was not the romantic kind, or at least that was what she told herself, because the romantic kind required a certain willingness to imagine a future, and Clara Whitmore had been very deliberate about not imagining futures since the one she'd built had been taken from her in 3 weeks of fever. What she was in was the other kind of trouble. The kind that came from watching someone too closely, from cataloging too many small details, from coffee left before sunrise, and a question asked in a voice that suggested the answer genuinely mattered. She was in the trouble of caring about a person she hadn't meant to care about. And caring in her experience was only ever the beginning of how things went wrong. So she did what she always did when her interior life threatened to become unmanageable. She worked harder. She started varying the meals beyond what was strictly required: cornbread, with a little extra sweetness on Fridays, dried apple pie, when the sugar stocks allowed extra coffee on cold mornings without waiting to be asked. She stayed up later, repairing whatever needed repairing. She anticipated problems before they became problems. Patching the water barrel when she noticed a seam going soft, reinforcing the chuck wagon's gate when the hinge started to strain. The men noticed. She could feel it happening, the way you could feel a change in weather before the sky did anything visible, a shift in the quality of attention. Small, but there. Roy Penders, who was 24 and largely kept to himself, started bringing firewood without being asked. Just appeared in the morning with an armload and set it down, and didn't say anything about it. Clara accepted it without making it into a moment, because she understood men like Roy. The gesture was the thing; the acknowledgement would only make him self-conscious and end it. Danny Webb, who was barely 17 and so homesick it came off him like a smell, started hovering near the wagon in the evenings. Not saying much, just being nearby. She began setting aside a slightly larger portion of whatever was sweetest in the evening meal, and leaving it where he'd find it without having to ask, and she never mentioned it, and neither did he, but his eyes stopped having that particular hollow quality they'd had the first 2 weeks. Old Bill said one evening, with the gruff understatement she'd learned to translate, "You're doing good work, Clara." It was the first time anyone on the drive had used her name without being corrected into it. She looked at him over the fire. "So are you, Bill," she said. He grunted, sipped his coffee. Didn't say anything else. It was in its way the nicest thing anyone had said to her in months. The storm came on the 42nd day, without much warning. There was sky in the afternoon, the kind of stillness that the experienced men recognized, and Clara was beginning to understand, a pressure and absence of birds, a particular quality to the light. She'd seen Old Bill look up twice in the span of an hour and press his lips together, and that was enough. She started moving without waiting to be told. She secured everything that could come loose. She checked the ropes on the supply tarps and doubled them. She moved the flour sacks to the highest corner of the wagon box and wrapped the coffee cans in the oilcloth she kept for exactly this purpose. She calculated what she could cook before the weather arrived and started on it immediately, so the men would have a hot meal before they were too wet and cold to care about anything but shelter. The storm hit at dusk. It came sideways, the kind that didn't so much fall as arrive horizontal and immediate, and with a wind behind it that turned the world into a wall of sound. The cattle were already in trouble before the first crack of thunder. She could hear them, feel them, a low, roiling disturbance that moved through the ground before it reached the air. The cowboys scattered to the herd. Thomas was already moving before she could fully register where he'd been standing, and Clara turned back to the fire. The wood was soaked within minutes. She worked with what she'd protected, coaxing the flame under the oilcloth cover she'd improvised, losing it twice and starting again. Her dress was soaked through. The wind was pulling at everything, and there were moments when she had to brace herself against the wagon with both hands just to stay on her feet. She kept going. She was not going to let these men come back from that herd in the rain and cold to no meal. That was not something she was willing to allow to happen. The trick she'd learned was to stop fighting the conditions and start working with whatever they'd leave you. The fire didn't want to be fire tonight. Fine. She'd coax it into something smaller and do what she could with that. The bread wasn't going to happen. Fine. What could she make that didn't need a full flame? She built a windbreak from a wagon board and a saddle blanket she sacrificed without ceremony and got a flame low and protected enough to hold, and she made soup. Plain and basic, the stock she'd been simmering all day, beans, salt pork, a little cornmeal to thicken it, but hot. The cowboys came in from the herd in ones and twos, soaked and cold, and past the edge of their endurance, and the first thing they hit was the smell of something warm, and Clara watched each of them stop for just a half second when it reached them, that involuntary pause before they'd consciously registered what it was, and something in her chest that she couldn't name clicked into place. Roy Penders took his cup of soup and said, hoarse from shouting over the herd, "I don't know how you did this." "It's soup, Roy," she said. I don't care what it is, he said, and his voice had a quality in it that had nothing to do with the soup, and everything to do with the fact that someone had made something and saved it for him, and that mattered out here in ways that nothing in regular life ever quite prepared you for. She refilled his cup before he asked. Thomas came in last. She'd expected that he was always the last one, in which she'd come to understand was a thing he did deliberately, making sure every man was accounted for before he let himself rest. He was soaked through his jacket, dark with rain, and she could see even in the limited light that his left hand was holding his right arm slightly away from his body, the unconscious guarded posture of something that was hurting. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. "I'm fine. You're holding your arm like a man who got thrown," she said. "Sit down." Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, not quite surprise, something that sat between the two, and he sat. She poured soup and brought it to him, and while he was holding the cup, she reached into the wagon for the liniment she kept and crouched down in front of him. "Right arm," she said. "Shoulder," he said. The horse spooked in the thunder. "I stayed on, but it wasn't elegant. Take off the jacket." He did slowly, and she could see the shoulder starting to stiffen. She warmed the liniment in her palms and worked it in with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been managing injuries since she was 12, and her father's farmhands couldn't afford a doctor. He was very still under her hands. "You do this for all the men," he said after a moment. "The ones too stubborn to ask," she said. She felt him exhale a slow, controlled release of something he'd been holding. "Clara," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "Drink your soup, Mr. Caldwell." "Thomas," he said. She paused. "My name is Thomas," he said, and his voice had that quality she'd learned to listen for, the drop in tone, the absence of air for argument. "I'd take it as a favor if you'd use it." She sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. His face was close in the firelight, rain damp, the tiredness in it real and unguarded. He was looking at her with that steady, careful attention that she had been trying with decreasing success to convince herself meant nothing at all. "Drink your soup, Thomas," she said. He did. She was washing the cups. The next morning, the storm gone, the sky washed clean, the drive already moving again, the way drives did, with that extraordinary capacity to simply resume when Walt Greer decided that the previous instruction he'd received had sufficient time decay that it might not apply anymore. She heard him before she saw him. His voice aimed somewhere to her left, carrying the particular quality of a man performing for an audience. "Funny how the boss always comes back to camp before the rest of us," he said. "Almost like he's got a reason." Clara didn't stop washing cups. "Suppose some men have different priorities," he continued, and there was a slyness in it now that was worse than the open cruelty had been. She set down the cup in her hand. She turned. Greer was standing with 3 other men, and 2 of them were actively not looking at anything in particular, which meant they'd heard enough to be uncomfortable and were hoping to be elsewhere when this resolved itself. "Mr. Greer," Clara said. He looked at her. "Cookie." "You want to say something to me, say it straight," she said. "I'm a grown woman, and I can handle a straight sentence. What I don't have patience for is a man making sounds like a barn cat, hoping someone notices him." The 2 men who wanted to be elsewhere took a step in that direction. Greer's expression went flat. "I'm just making an observation." "Your observation is wrong," Clara said steadily. "Mr. Caldwell came back to camp last night because a man checks his camp. What happened in his camp was, I gave him liniment for a shoulder that was seizing up after a bad pull in the storm. The same thing I'd do for any man here who was hurting and wouldn't ask. If you've got a problem with that, take it somewhere that isn't my kitchen." Greer stared at her. "And for the record," she said, keeping her voice level, "if you're wondering whether Mr. Caldwell's instructions to you from last week are still in effect, they are. Because behavior like this isn't something that has an expiration date, and I promise you, Mr. Greer, that I will not be the one who ends up sorry about this conversation." She picked up the cup she'd set down. She went back to washing it. She heard Greer's boots on the dirt, the direction of retreat, and then the 2 men who'd wanted to be elsewhere saying nothing at all, and then silence, which was the correct ending to the matter. Her hands were not shaking. She acknowledged privately, getting genuinely good at this. The letter was the thing that changed everything. They were at a water stop on the 48th day, a creek wide enough that the herd needed to be managed through it in sections, and Clara was on the bank upstream, refilling the water barrel, when she heard a rider coming hard from the south, not part of the drive. She was aware of the commotion without being part of it, the way the camp organized itself around a rider bringing newsmen, stopping what they were doing. That specific quality of attention, that meant something had arrived that wasn't expected. She finished with the barrel. She brought the wagon up. When she came into camp, Thomas was standing apart from the men reading a letter, and the quality of his stillness was entirely different from his usual stillness. This was not the stillness of a man in control. This was the stillness of a man absorbing a blow. Old Bill was nearby, not pretending he wasn't watching. Clara brought him coffee without being asked, and set it in his line of sight, and went back to the wagon. 20 minutes later, Thomas came to the wagon. "I need to ask you something," he said. His voice was controlled. Too controlled in the way voices got when they were working very hard. She looked at him. "Ask." "The letters from my sister. Lily's sick." He stopped. "Martha says it's not serious fever broke, she's improving, but—" He stopped again, and she could see him doing the math she'd already done. How many days to Kansas? How many more to Montana? How long before he could see his daughter with his own eyes? "I can't leave the drive." "No," Clara said. "You can't." "I know that," he said sharply, and then immediately, "I'm sorry, I know that." "Don't apologize," she said. "You're scared. Scared comes out sideways. I know that too." He looked at her with an expression that was raw in a way she'd never seen from him. "She's 7 years old today," he said. "Yesterday, the birthday. She's sick for her birthday, and I am standing in the middle of Texas." Clara was quiet for a moment. "She has Martha," she said. "And you said Martha is good. And the letter says the fever broke." She paused. "Thomas, the fever broke. She is already on the other side of the worst of it." He pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead briefly. A gesture she'd never seen from him, a crack in the composure. "I know," he said. "I know all of that. I also know that she is 7 years old and sick, and her father is not there, and I can do the calculation and still not stop." He cut himself off, jaw working. "You can't stop being her father," Clara said quietly. "That's not a flaw. That's just what it is to love a child." He looked at her, and for one moment in the space between his exhale and whatever he was going to say next, she saw him fully. Not the trail boss. Not the competent, controlled man who held the drive together. Just Thomas, who had lost his wife and was raising 2 children alone and couldn't be there for his daughter's birthday, and was standing in the open with his grief showing because there was apparently nowhere else left to put it. She held his gaze. She didn't say anything else. He reached out very briefly, and his hand closed over hers, where it rested on the wagon gate. Not long, not dramatic, the duration of a breath, and then he released it and stepped back and put the trail boss back on. "Thank you," he said. His voice was steady again. "Go write her a letter," Clara said. "The writer'll take it back south, and there's a post road at Millhaven. It might beat you home." He blinked. "I don't—" "There's ink and paper in the supply box," she said. "I keep it for accounting. Take what you need." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. Then he said, "What would I say?" "Tell her you're coming home," Clara said. "Tell her you're proud of her for being brave. Tell her the trail sends its love." She paused. "Tell her Cookie is saving the last of the dried apples for a pie for when she's well." Something crossed his face, brief, complicated. "She doesn't know you," he said. "No," Clara said. "But she will." The words were out before she'd examined them. She felt heat climb her neck. "If she ever passes through Texas, I mean. Or—" She stopped, picked up a dish rag. "Just take the paper, Thomas." He was very still for one moment. Then he said, "Clara." And the way he said her name, she understood, was not the way a trail boss addressed the trail cook. She looked up. But he had already turned to go, and whatever was on his face, she only caught the edge of, and it was enough that she stood with the dish rag in her hand for a full minute after he'd walked away, and couldn't have told you what she was thinking about, except that the word home was sitting in her chest, in a place she hadn't let anything sit in a very long time. The drive pushed north. Days collapsed into the rhythm she'd mastered: early rising, fire, coffee meals, breaking camp, driving the wagon ahead, setting up again, cooking again, cleaning again, sleeping fewer hours than she needed, and waking up before she'd finished. But something had shifted in the fabric of the drive. She felt it the way you feel a change in a household, not in any one thing, but in the aggregate, in the texture of the ordinary days. The men spoke to her differently. Not softer exactly. Cowboys didn't do soft, but with a quality of regard that hadn't been there in the first weeks. Roy still brought firewood. Danny still appeared near the wagon in the evenings. Old Bill, who she was developing a genuine affection for, that she was choosing not to examine too closely, started teaching her which plants along the trail were edible and which were going to make you desperately regret a decision. And Thomas. Thomas managed the impossible thing of being both more distant and more present simultaneously. More distant in the sense that he was scrupulously careful now about how he addressed her in front of the men. Formal, appropriate, the correct register of a trail boss speaking to his trail cook. More present in the sense that she was aware of him in the way you were aware of weather. She didn't have to be looking at him to know where he was in the camp. She didn't have to be listening for him to know when he rode in. Some parts of her had calibrated to him without her permission, and she couldn't figure out how to uncalibrate it. She didn't try, she just cooked. And she carried the word home very carefully in the place she'd put it, and she didn't take it out to look at it, but she didn't put it down either. Not yet. On the 54th night, everything changed. The herd had been restless since midday. She'd felt it even from the wagon, that low collective unease that moved through cattle when something in the air had shifted and the night riders were doing double duty keeping them settled. She was banking the fire for the night when she heard the sound. Low at first, then rising. She didn't know the sound right away. She'd never heard it like this. Then she placed it, and the recognition hit her with the force of something physical. The herd was running, not moving, not drifting, running. She could feel it in the ground before she heard it fully, that sub-bass vibration that preceded the sound itself, and then it was everywhere, a roar that wasn't quite thunder and wasn't quite anything else. She had a word for 3,000 feet of cattle and bone and panic moving together at full speed in the dark. She couldn't see what had started it. She could hear the cowboys shouting. She could hear Thomas's voice above the others, cutting through the chaos, with that particular register, steady, authoritative, directing the men to the flanks, and she could hear the herd responding not to calm, but to something worse, the sound of cattle that had gone beyond the point where anything calmed them. Stamped. The word moved through her cold. She grabbed the mule's harness and had him backed up against the draw gully before she'd made a conscious decision to do it. The wagon was the most critical thing. The food, the supplies, and she got the brake on and tied the mule to the gully stake and turned to look at the chaos. In the darkness and the noise, she almost missed him. But she didn't miss him. She never missed him. Thomas's horse was down. She could see that much in the moonlight and the moving dark. The horse not still, but the specific struggling motion of an animal that had fallen and was trying to rise and couldn't, and Thomas not in the saddle. Thomas on the ground. Thomas in the path of the outer edge of the running herd. The cowboys were too far. She could hear them calling, but too far. The cattle were not. Clara Whitmore picked up the cattle whip from the wagon seat. She did not make a calculation. She ran, and the ground shook under her feet. That was the thing nobody told you about a stampede. It wasn't just the sound. It wasn't just the sight of it. It was the way the earth itself lost its reliability. The way it trembled and shifted like something alive beneath your boots, like the ground had decided it wasn't on your side anymore and you were entirely on your own. Clara didn't stop. She had the whip in her right hand, and she was running toward the sound and the dark and the shaking earth, and every reasonable thought she possessed was telling her this was the wrong direction, and she was doing it anyway because Thomas was down and the herd was coming and there was nobody else close enough. That was the only calculation she made. Nobody else close enough. So she ran. She could hear the lead cattle now. Not just feel them, hear them. The particular sound of hooves at full panic, which was nothing like the sound of hooves at any other speed. A kind of roar that wasn't organized, that had no rhythm, that was pure mass and terror translated into motion. She could see Thomas. How was on his feet. She registered that with a relief so sharp it was almost pain, but barely one knee on the ground. His right arm braced against something she couldn't see, and the horse was between him and the herd, which was both helping and not helping, because the horse was still struggling and panicked and taking up space. Thomas needed to move through. She was 20 feet away, then 15. She cracked the whip. The sound of it, that sharp explosive crack that a good whip made when you got the wrist right, cut through the roar like a rifle shot, and the lead steer, the one at the point of the outer edge of the running mass, threw its head up and veered. Just enough. Just barely enough. She cracked it again and again, moving laterally, putting herself between Thomas and the edge of the herd and driving that edge. Not the whole herd, she knew better than to think she could stop a stampede. But this edge, this outer margin where the cattle were running on instinct and not purpose, and could still be redirected by a sufficiently startling interruption. The cattle split around her, not cleanly, not with any elegance. The outer edge pulled left, and the animals behind it followed the shape the lead had made. And for 30 seconds, Clara stood in that gap dress, tearing in the wind of their passing smoke and dust. Just in her eyes. The sound so enormous it had become more like weather than noise. And she held her ground, and she kept moving the whip, and the cattle kept going around her. Then they were past. The roar diminished. The ground steadied. And Clara became aware in the sudden relative quiet that she was shaking from her jaw to her knees, that her right arm felt like it had been wrenched from a different body, and that Thomas Caldwell was 2 feet in front of her, with an expression on his face that she had never seen from him before and did not yet have a word for. "Clara," he said. His voice came out wrong. Not the controlled register, not the trail boss. Something raw and unprocessed that she didn't know how to absorb. "Are you hurt?" she said, because that was the functional question, that was the question that had a useful answer. He crossed the 2 feet between them, and his hands were on her arms, steadying her. She realized because she was still shaking, and hadn't been aware of the degree, until something external stopped the movement, and he was looking at her face. The way he looked at things, he was trying to understand, except that this time she did not think he was going to arrive at the answer in his usual quiet, methodical way. "Are you out of your mind?" he said. "Probably," she said. "You ran into a stampede. You were in the path of one. I was getting up. I had it. You were on one knee," she said steadily, "and the outer edge of that herd was 15 seconds from you, and your horse was between you and the only clear direction, and you didn't have 15 seconds. He stared at her. "I did the math," she said. The math said run. I was still holding her arms, and they were both still breathing too hard, and the dust was settling around them like something the world was exhaling, and she could hear the cowboys in the distance working to slow the herd, and the night settling back into whatever it was going to be after this. "You could have been killed," Thomas said, and the rawness in his voice had not gone away. "So could you," Clara said. And then, because she was very tired, and her hands were shaking, and she had just run into a cattle stampede, and apparently that was the kind of thing that removed your last remaining barriers to honesty, she said. "I wasn't going to stand there and watch that happen." The words sat between them in the dark. Thomas looked at her for a long, suspended moment. Then he pulled her in and held her, his arms around her shoulders, her face against his chest, and she felt the shaking in him that matched the shaking in her, the shared aftermath of something that had nearly gone another way. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She stood in the dark in the settling dust, with her face against Thomas Caldwell's chest, and she let herself be held for exactly as long as it lasted, which was about 15 seconds before boots on the ground announced the arrival of the rest of the drive. He stepped back. She stepped back. Old Bill arrived first, breathing hard, and took in the scene with the trained economy of a man who'd been on enough drives to know when to ask questions and when to not. "Herd's turning," he said. "Roy and the boys are bringing them around. Anybody hurt?" "No," Thomas said. Clara held up the whip. "Lost a little leather," she said. Old Bill looked at the whip, looked at her, looked at Thomas, composed whatever he was thinking into a single controlled exhale. Right, he said. I'll let the boys know. He walked away without another word, which told her that he had understood everything perfectly and would be keeping it to himself. The camp that night had the particular quality of aftermath, men moving quieter than usual, speaking in lower voices, the way people moved after something had reminded them how fast things could turn. Thomas said nothing more to her directly. How was in trail boss mode, now assessing, directing, accounting for every man and every animal doing the work that a near disaster created. She understood that. She went back to the wagon, and she banked the fire properly this time, and she sat down on the wagon step and let herself feel the full weight of what the last hour had been. Her hands were still not entirely steady. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. She had run into a cattle stampede. She had done it without deciding to, which was either the most natural thing in the world or the most alarming, and she was not certain she was prepared to figure out which one. What she was prepared to acknowledge sitting on that wagon step in the dark, with the fire low beside her, was that the thing she'd been careful not to build the story. The future, the shape of something she wouldn't let herself name, had apparently been building itself without her supervision, had apparently been building itself for weeks. One cup of coffee, and one quiet conversation, and one moment at a river crossing at a time, and had arrived at the point where her body made decisions that her mind had not caught up to yet. That was either very good or very bad. She genuinely did not know which. Roy Penders came to her before she'd made up her mind to stop thinking about it. He came alone, which was unusual, and he sat down on the ground near the fire without being invited, which was also unusual, and he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "I've been on 4 drives," he said. "Seen 3 stampedes." Clara looked at him. "Never saw anybody do what you did tonight," he said. "Not a cowboy, not anybody." He was quiet again. "I was coming. I was riding as fast as I could ride, and I wasn't going to make it. And I knew I wasn't going to make it. And then there you were just—" He stopped, shook his head. "Just standing there with that whip like you'd done it your whole life." "I hadn't," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." He looked at the fire. "I just wanted to say that. Somebody ought to say it." Clara looked at Roy Penders, who was 24 years old and largely kept to himself and had been bringing her firewood every morning for 3 weeks. And she thought about how people revealed themselves when the pressure got high enough, not the version they wanted to present, but the actual version underneath. "Thank you, Roy," she said. He nodded, got up, went back to his bedroll. She sat with that for a while. Thomas came to her at midnight. She was still awake. She'd given up on sleep as a reasonable expectation, and he came out of the dark without his jacket, which meant he'd been sitting somewhere thinking and had come to a conclusion. She recognized the signs by now. "Sit down," she said. He sat. They were quiet for a moment, both of them looking at the low fire, and the camp was settled around them, and the herd was quiet, and the night had gone back to just being night. "I owe you my life," Thomas said. "You don't owe me anything," Clara said. "Clara, I made a decision," she said. "I made it because I wanted to make it. That's not a debt. That's just a thing that happened." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he said. She looked at him. "Why did you want to?" he said, and his voice was very quiet and very direct. She held his gaze for a long moment. "You know why," she said. The fire snapped. He looked at her with an expression that she could now read fluently after 54 days, and it was the expression of a man who was holding something carefully because he was afraid of what he'd do if he set it down wrong. "I have 2 children in Montana," he said. "I know. I have a ranch that needs running, and a drive that needs finishing, and a life that isn't—" He stopped. "It isn't simple, Clara. What I'm carrying isn't simple." "I didn't say it was," she said. "I didn't say anything." "No," he said. "You ran into a stampede, which said considerably more." She almost smiled, stopped herself. "Thomas." "I know," he said. And then more quietly, "I'm aware of what I'm feeling. I've been aware of it for weeks. I'm also aware that I don't have the right to ask anything of you based on that. You came on this drive to earn a wage. That's where it ends if you want it to." She looked at him for a long moment. "And if I don't want it to?" she said. The fire went low. He reached over and took her hand, not the brief press of earlier, but a real hold. His fingers through hers, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because sometimes the thing that needed to be communicated did not require words. They sat like that until the fire went out. Then Thomas said quietly, "Get some sleep, Clara." She went to her bedroll. She did not sleep for some time, but for the first time in months, that was not because she was afraid of anything. She was wrong to think the hardest part was behind them. The next morning she woke to a different kind of trouble. Danny Webb, who was 17 and homesick, and whom she had been quietly looking after for weeks, was sitting outside her wagon before sunrise with his knees to his chest, and an expression that had moved past unhappy into something that looked like he'd made a decision, and wasn't sure yet if he was going to regret it. "Danny," she said, crouching down in front of him. "What happened?" He looked at her with the particular look of a very young man who had been holding something together through sheer determination and had finally run out of determination. "I got a letter," he said. "Same writer that brought Mr. Caldwell's a few days back. I didn't say anything because—" He stopped. "My mama's sick, Mrs. Whitmore. Real sick. Not fever-breaking sick. The other kind." Clara went very still. "How old is your mother?" she asked. 41, he said. It's her lungs. She's had trouble with her lungs since winter, and the letter says she's not—" He stopped again. His throat worked. "I want to go home." "I know," Clara said. "But I can't," he said. "We're 2 weeks from Kansas, and if I leave now, I lose the whole wage and my family needs the wage because that's why I'm here and—" His voice cracked badly on the last word, and he pressed his mouth together hard. Clara sat down in the dirt beside him. She put her hand on his back. She didn't say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say to this particular species of awful, the one where every option was wrong, and all you could do was choose which kind of wrong you could live with. "Does Thomas know?" she said finally. Danny shook his head. "I didn't want to. He's got his own—" "Danny." She turned to look at him directly. "Listen to me. Thomas Caldwell is a man who's been away from his sick daughter for the last week and has not stopped working for a single day. He's also a man who knows what it is to have family on the other side of a distance you can't close fast enough. You need to talk to him." The boy looked at her. "What if he docks my pay?" "He won't," she said. And she knew this as clearly as she knew anything on this drive. "You don't know that. I know him," she said. "Go. After breakfast, I'll come with you if you want." He was quiet for a moment. "Would you?" he said. "Yes," she said. They went to Thomas together after the morning meal, Clara and Danny standing side by side, and she let Danny tell it himself because he needed to, and because a man who couldn't tell his own trouble didn't own it yet. Thomas listened without moving. When Danny finished, there was a silence that had a specific quality. Not the silence of a man calculating cost, but the silence of a man who was feeling something and managing it. "Your mother's name," Thomas said. Danny blinked. "Ma'am, I mean Ruth. Ruth Webb." "How far is your family from the nearest post road?" "Maybe 6 miles outside of Cutter's Mill." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'll take your full wage, and I'll advance you against next season's work if you need it for your mother's care. You don't have to choose between the money and going home, Danny. Nobody should have to make that choice." Danny stared at him. "The drive's 2 weeks from Abilene," Thomas continued. "If you leave today and ride hard, you can make it back to Texas in 8 days. Your full wages will be waiting in Abilene at the Cattleman's Bank under your name." The boy's face was doing something complicated and losing the battle with it. "Sir," he managed. "Go pack your gear," Thomas said. "And Danny." He waited until the boy looked at him. "Ruth Webb sounds like a woman who raised a boy who rides hard and works harder and doesn't complain. You tell her that a trail boss in Texas said so." Danny Webb turned away very quickly and walked toward his bedroll, and Clara was quite certain he was crying and doing his level best to do it where nobody could see. She looked at Thomas. He looked back at her with an expression that said he was not interested in being thanked for this, and was also aware that she was going to do it anyway. "Thank you," she said. "He's 17, Thomas said, "and his mother is sick. The cattle can wait." He walked away. She stood in the space he'd left and felt the thing in her chest that she'd been trying not to name do something it had never done before. It settled. Not the restless, anxious thing it had been for months. Something that sat still and quiet and certain. She went back to the wagon. She made a meal that was by the standards of a trail cook 3 weeks from the end of a cattle drive extraordinary. She didn't know why, except that she needed her hands to be doing something, and this was what her hands knew how to do. The second twist came from a direction she hadn't been watching. On the 58th day, a rider came in from the north. Not a messenger. A man dressed too well for the trail on a horse too clean for it, with the particular bearing of someone who was accustomed to arriving places and finding them arranged for his comfort. His name, she heard from the camp, was Edward Holt. He was a land agent, and he had business with Thomas Caldwell. She didn't know any of this at first. She was aware of the visitor the way she was aware of most things at the periphery of the camp. She saw the arrival, noted the quality of Thomas's posture when the man approached, and went back to her work. It was old Bill who filled her in later, with the careful neutralness of a man delivering information and declining to editorialize. "Holt's a land agent out of Kansas City," Bill said. "Works for the Eastern Railroad interests. Been buying up cattle land in Montana and Wyoming for the last 3 years. "And he's here because," Clara said, "because the Caldwell Ranch in Montana sits on the route they want for the Northern Spur," Bill said. "They've been trying to buy Thomas out for 2 years. He's refused twice." Clara looked up from the biscuits. "And now he came all the way out here to a working trail drive," she said. "Ma'am," said Bill. "That's not a courtesy call," she said. "No," said Bill. "It is not." She watched from the margins she'd gotten good at occupying for the rest of the afternoon. Holt was a smooth man. She could see that from across the camp, the kind of smooth that came from practice, from knowing how to present himself, from understanding which version of himself would be most effective in which situation. He had sized up Thomas's situation very accurately, she thought. A long drive, a tired crew, a trail boss who'd been away from home for weeks and knew his daughter had been sick, and had a son who went silent when things were wrong. Those were leverage points if a man knew how to use them. She didn't like Edward Holt. She had not spoken a word to him yet, but she had been reading people from the edges of rooms since she was 12 years old, and she knew what a man looked like when he'd come somewhere with the intention of winning before the other person understood there was a contest. Thomas would handle it. She knew that. He was not a man who could be maneuvered easily, but she watched anyway. The confrontation happened after supper. She was cleaning up when she heard the voices shift in register near the far fire where Holt had been sitting with Thomas, and she did not move toward them. That was not her place, and she knew it, but she stilled her hands and listened. She heard Holt's voice carrying the particular smoothness of a man making an offer he considered reasonable. 2 years from now, that railroad comes through, whether the land changes hands or not, Mr. Caldwell. What you hold now is leverage. What you'll hold when the spur is completed is a ranch cut in half by a rail line. I'm offering you fair value on the front end of that equation." She heard Thomas's voice controlled and even. "I've heard this argument before, Mr. Holt, twice. And I'm making it a third time," Holt said, "because the offer has improved, and because you're a practical man, and practical men revise their positions when the facts change." "What facts have changed?" Thomas said. A pause. "Your situation is more complicated than it was," Holt said, and something in his voice shifted, still smooth, but with a different edge now. "You're running cattle with a reduced crew. You've got children at home. Word is your daughter's been unwell." The silence that followed was the specific kind that preceded a weather change. When Thomas spoke, he was very quiet. "You want to be careful," he said, "about how you use my children in a business conversation." "I'm not using them," Holt said, backpedaling slightly, hearing the edge he'd found. I'm observing that your circumstances are my circumstances, Thomas said. And now that Register Clara knew was fully present, the drop in tone, the slowing of pace, the absence of air for argument to grow in, are not yours to observe or to factor into your offer. Mr. Holt, my ranch is not for sale. The answer was no 2 years ago, and it's no today. And if you've come 300 miles for a third, no, I'm sorry for the wasted ride, but I am not going to give you anything different. A long pause. You're making a mistake, Holt said. I've made mistakes before, Thomas said. They were mine to make. She heard the sound of a man standing, then boots on dirt moving away. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. 30 seconds later, Thomas was at the edge of the firelight near her wagon. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. You heard that, he said. It wasn't a question. Hard not to, she said. He'll be back, Thomas said. Holt or someone like him. The railroad doesn't quit. No, she said. But neither do you. He looked at her. The ranch, she said. What's it like? Howe was quiet for a moment, apparently adjusting to the change in direction. Then slowly, as if he was pulling something up from a long way down. High ground, he said. You can see 4 mountain ranges from the porch on a clear day. The grass in summer is... He stopped. There's a kitchen with a window that faces east. Helen put herbs in the window. I haven't been able to make things grow there since. She heard the thing underneath the words. Lily likes plants, he said. She keeps trying. She's pulled up everything she's planted so far because she checks on them too often, and she can't quite believe they'll grow without her watching. Clara thought about a 7-year-old girl who checked on things too often because she was afraid they'd disappear while she wasn't looking, and she thought about what kind of loss taught a child that particular anxiety, and she thought about a kitchen window facing east with nothing growing in it. What herbs? She said. He looked at her. What herbs did Helen grow? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Rosemary, he said. Sage. She tried lavender once, but it never took. Rosemary is hard to kill, Clara said. You plant it once and it comes back, even in hard winters. He was watching her the way he'd watched her that very first morning at the camp, that look that was building a picture in his head and intended to keep it. Clara, he said. What? When this drive is finished, he said slowly, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that it is not a small thing I'll be asking, and I don't take it lightly, and you are under no obligation to answer yes. She held very still. When this drive is finished, she said carefully, I will listen to whatever you have to say. He looked at her for one long, quiet moment. Then he said, All right. He walked back to the camp. Clara stood beside the fire and pressed one hand flat against her sternum and felt her heartbeat, which was doing something it had not done in 6 months. Not the fast, frightened beating of grief and survival, but something slower and steadier and more alarming than either. Something that felt dangerously and entirely without her permission, like hope. Greer made his last move on the 60th day. She had almost stopped watching for it, had almost decided that Thomas's correction had held, and Greer had chosen in the end to let the thing go. She was wrong. It happened not to her, but about her, which was in some ways worse. She was on the far side of the wagon when she heard Greer's voice carrying toward a group of 3 men who were between her and him, and who could see her, but whom Greer apparently hadn't noticed. Man's lost his mind over the cook, Greer said. You see the way he looks at her, ought to be running a cattle drive, not playing house with the fat woman at the chuck wagon. She heard the quality of the silence from the 3 men between them. She came around the wagon. Greer saw her. The silence became total, and Clara Whitmore, who had handled this man twice before, with the controlled, measured response that was designed to end the situation without escalating it, understood with perfect clarity that she was done being controlled and measured about Walt Greer. She walked up to him. She stopped when she was close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. Say it again, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Greer said nothing. You've got an opinion, she said. You've had it for 2 months. You've been saying it in corners and at the edges of conversations and behind people's backs, and I have been reasonable about it because I am generally a reasonable person." She paused. "I'm done being reasonable, Mr. Greer. You want to question Mr. Caldwell's judgment, you do it to his face. You want to say something about me, you say it to my face. But this—" She let the word sit. "This ends. Today. Because I will not spend another 60 miles listening to a man with nothing to recommend him tear down people who have earned every bit of the regard he can't stand that they have." Greer's jaw was tight. "You done?" he said. "I'm done when you're gone," she said. He held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he walked away. One of the 3 men who'd been standing between them, a quiet drover named Sam, who Clara knew only from his preference for extra salt and his habit of saying grace before meals, looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. Not directed at anything specific, just an acknowledgement. She nodded, went back to the wagon. Behind her, she heard Sam say to the other 2, in a voice that carried just enough to be intended to carry, "I always said that woman was something." She almost smiled. She didn't, but it was close. Thomas was waiting at the wagon when she got back. She did not know how long he'd been there. His expression told her he'd been there long enough. "How much did you hear?" she said. "Enough," he said. She braced. "If you're going to tell me, I should have let you handle it." "I'm not," he said. "I'm going to tell you that I should have handled it 3 weeks ago, and I let it go on longer than I should have, and I'm sorry for that." She stopped. "I'm going to let Greer go in Abilene," Thomas said. "He's a good drover and a bad man, and I've been keeping those 2 things balanced for too long. They don't balance anymore." "That's your decision," she said. "It is," he said. And then quietly, "Are you all right?" She looked at him. At the question on his face, which was not a formality and not a performance, but exactly what it presented itself as a man who wanted to know. "Yes," she said. "You sure?" "Thomas," she said. "I've been all right since I stopped waiting for someone else to decide I was allowed to be." He was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is the most Clara Whitmore sentence I've ever heard." And this time, she did smile, and it broke across her face before she could stop it, and she saw him watch it happen with that look. He had the one that built pictures to keep, and she did not look away. "Go run your cattle drive," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He walked away, and she watched him go, and she thought about a ranch with high ground and 4 mountain ranges and a kitchen window facing east, and a little girl who checked on things too often because she was afraid they'd disappear. She thought about Rosemary. She thought about how it came back even in hard winters. She thought 9 more days to Abilene, and she went to work. 9 days. That was what she had told herself the night she'd watched Thomas walk back to his cattle and his drive and his careful, measured life. 9 days to Abilene. 9 days to the end of the trail, to the end of the job, to the moment when she would collect her $36, and Thomas Caldwell would say whatever it was he intended to say, and she would answer it, and whatever came after that would be whatever came after that. 9 days felt manageable. 9 days felt like something she could hold. She was wrong about that too. The first sign that the last stretch of trail was not going to behave itself came on the 62nd day, when old Bill rode back from scouting position, with his mouth pressed into a line that she had come to understand meant the news was not good, and he was deciding how to say it. "Waterhole at Cedar Flat's been fouled," he said when Thomas met him at the edge of camp. "Something upstream. Could be natural, could be cattle from a different drive passing through early. Either way, it's bad water, and we can't use it." Thomas looked at the sky, then at the horizon, then at Bill. "Next reliable water," he said. 12 miles, Bill said. "If we push hard." "How long have the cattle been without since the last crossing?" "Coming on 18 hours, Bill said. "They'll make 12 miles. They won't like it." Thomas looked at Clara without appearing to look at her, which was a thing he'd gotten quite precise about. "How are we on water for the crew?" 2 barrels, she said. "That's drinking water and cooking water combined for today and tonight if we're careful. I can make it stretch to tomorrow morning." "We push through," Thomas said. Tell Roy to start moving the herd. Bill went. Thomas stayed for half a second longer than he needed to, and in that half second he said quietly, and not looking at her, "Stay close to the main body today. Don't get out ahead." "You're expecting trouble," she said. "Thirsty cattle are unpredictable cattle," he said. "And 12 miles is a long push." She looked at him. "Thomas." He looked at her. "I'll stay close," she said. He touched his hat and went back to the herd. The 12 miles were the hardest of the drive. Not dramatic hard the way the storm had been, or the stampede, but a grinding, relentless kind of hard that sat in the bones and didn't let go. Thirsty cattle were not panicked cattle. They were something worse in some ways. They were single-minded cattle, and a single-minded animal that outweighed a horse and had horns was a particular kind of problem on a narrow trail. The men worked constantly. Clara drove the wagon and watched them and understood in a way she hadn't fully understood before the degree to which this work was physical at a level that most people never encountered. Not just skilled, not just dangerous, but physically demanding in a way that used a man up day after day, until by the end of a drive, what remained was a leaner and more essential version of whoever he'd been at the start. She understood this because she felt it in herself. The woman who had stood in front of Warren Dodd 6 weeks ago and said, "I need this job," was not the same woman driving this wagon today. That woman had been running on fear and desperation and a stubborn refusal to be beaten. This woman was something else. She was still stubborn. That hadn't changed. But the fear had changed shape. It had compressed down into something harder and smaller and more useful. A stone rather than a flood. Something she carried in her pocket rather than something she was swimming in. She drove the wagon, and she thought about this, and she watched Thomas manage an impossible situation with the particular competence that she had spent 62 days falling in love with, and she let herself use that word for the first time inside her own head, where no one else could reach it. In love. There it was. She'd known it since the stampede, really. Probably before the stampede. But knowing a thing and saying the word for it were different acts, and she had needed 62 days and a 12-mile push on bad water to get to the word. "Right," she said to herself. "All right. That's what it is." And then, because she was a practical woman who had survived considerable difficulty through the application of practical thinking. Now what? Now they were still 9 days from Abilene, and the cattle were thirsty, and Thomas was riding the edge of the herd, looking like a man who had not slept enough in 2 months, and she had a wagon to drive and a crew to feed. That was now what? She focused on the road. They hit water at mid-afternoon, and the relief that went through the herd, audible, physical, a collective exhale that moved through 3,000 animals simultaneously, was one of the more extraordinary things she'd witnessed on the drive. The cowboys let the cattle drink and held them from drinking too fast, which was its own delicate management problem. And Clara got the wagon positioned and had coffee on inside of 20 minutes, because the men were going to need it, and she was not going to make them wait. Thomas came to the fire when the herd was settled. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been running on determination and not much else, and was allowing himself exactly 30 minutes to let the determination down before he had to pick it back up. She handed him coffee. He took it. "Good job today," he said. "Keeping the wagon up with us." "You told me to stay close," she said. "I told a lot of men things today," he said. "You're the only one who didn't argue with me about it." She almost said you'd be surprised how much arguing I do internally, but what she said was, "How far behind schedule are we?" "Half a day," he said. "We can make it up if the weather holds." "Will it hold?" He looked at the sky with the practiced squint she'd seen him use before. "Probably," he said. "That's not a yes," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." He drank his coffee, and she watched him visibly organizing himself, the small adjustments of posture and expression that meant he was putting the trail boss back in place. And she thought about what he'd said 7 days ago, about asking her something when the drive was finished, and she thought about how 8 more days was both a very long time and no time at all. "Thomas," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're going to ask me," she said, "the answer isn't going to change between here and Abilene." He was very still. "Is that right?" he said. "I'm telling you," she said carefully. so you can stop carrying it around like something that might not survive the trip." He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she could now read completely every register of it, and what it said was, "You are the most confounding woman I have ever met, and I am deeply grateful for it." What he said was, "You're going to make the rest of this drive very complicated." "I've been making your drive complicated for 2 months," she said. "You seem to manage." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood, and finished his coffee, and went back to the herd. She stood with the empty cup and the fire, and the afternoon settling around her, and she realized happy. Not the cautious provisional happiness of someone waiting for the other shoe. Just happy. Simply and without qualification, in the way that she'd forgotten people were allowed to be. She held that feeling carefully. She'd learned to hold things carefully. The twist she hadn't seen coming arrived on the 65th day, and it came wearing a familiar face. The rider came from the south, same direction as all the other riders, and at first she thought it was just another piece of trail business. Supply depot message weather report, ranch communication of the ordinary kind. She was at the wagon, and she watched the rider approach, and then she recognized the horse, and then she recognized the man, and something cold moved through her chest. The rider was Harold Briggs. Harold Briggs was a lawyer from Harding, Texas. How was also Margaret Ellison's nephew, a fact she'd always found quietly significant, and he was the man who had drawn up the mortgage on the farmhouse after James died, and he was the man who had sent her 3 letters in the months before she'd taken this job. Each one progressively less patient about the payment schedule, and he was the man she had been hoping very sincerely not to see for the next several months while she assembled enough money to deal with him. He pulled up at the edge of camp and looked around with the careful look of a man who was not accustomed to trail camps and was not going to admit that. He found her. He smiled with a warmth that she didn't trust and had never trusted. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I was told I'd find you here." "Mr. Briggs," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of her voice. He dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose backside had suffered a great deal that day, and was pretending otherwise, and he came to her with a leather satchel under one arm and the smile still in place. "I've ridden quite a ways," he said. "I can see that," she said. "What do you want, Harold?" The smile adjusted slightly. He'd always been disconcerted by the way she addressed him. Most women in Harding were not that direct, or at least not with lawyers. "The Whitmore property," he said. "I'm afraid the situation has become somewhat urgent." She held very still. "The bank has had an offer," he said. "A very good offer actually, from a buyer who is quite motivated, and given the arrears on the mortgage." "I have the money," she said. He paused. "I beg your pardon." "I have 3 months' wages coming at the end of this drive," she said. $36. That covers what's owed." Briggs opened his satchel. He removed a paper and held it out. She took it. She read it. The number at the bottom was not $36. The number at the bottom was $54, and it took her exactly 4 seconds to understand why the late fees, the legal costs, the administrative charges that had been accumulating in the fine print of a document she'd signed when she was 18 years old and newly married and trusting and not yet fluent in the language of men who built fees into fine print. "There have been costs," Briggs said with a regret so precisely manufactured she could see the seams. "There have been costs, you added," she said. He tilted his head. "The mortgage agreement specifies." "I know what the mortgage agreement specifies," she said. "I know it very well, Harold. What I'd like you to explain is why you've ridden 300 miles onto a working trail drive to deliver a paper that could have waited 2 weeks until I reached Abilene." Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man deciding which version of his answer to use. "The buyer's offer has a deadline," he said. "End of the month." "Today is the 19th, she said. "The end of the month is 11 days away. I'll be in Abilene in 8. "The buyer has indicated some flexibility might be required." "Harold," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "If you have ridden 300 miles to pressure me into accepting $18 less than the mortgage value of my home, because you have a buyer who wants it, and you thought catching me on a trail drive without access to a lawyer would be effective." She stopped, picked up the paper, folded it. Get off this drive. He blinked. Mrs. Whitmore. I said get off this drive, she said. I will be in Abilene in 8 days with my wages. I will pay what I legitimately owe with interest, and I will have the deed to that property in my hands by the end of the month. And if you sell it in the meantime, you will explain that to a judge, which I promise you I will make happen. You can't afford a lawyer, he said, and there was an edge under the smoothness now, something that had been there all along. No, she said. But I can afford paper and ink, and I can write a letter to Judge Carver in Fort Worth, who knew my father, and explain what's been happening with the late fees on this mortgage and let him have a look at the paperwork. She paused. Unless you'd like to tell me that the fees are entirely proper, in which case you have nothing to worry about. Briggs stared at her. She looked back at him without blinking. 8 days, she said. I'll be in Abilene in 8 days. He put the satchel under his arm. He walked back to his horse. He mounted with the stiff movements of a man who had also not enjoyed the ride back that he was contemplating. He left. Clara turned back to the wagon. Her hands were shaking, not from fear this time. From something hotter than that something that had lived in her chest since the day Margaret Ellison had held her hands on the boardwalk and told her James had married her out of generosity, something she'd been holding down and managing for months. She pressed both hands flat on the wagon gate and breathed through it. She heard boots behind her. Clara. Thomas. She turned. He was standing close enough that she could see he'd been within earshot for most of it, which meant he'd chosen not to intervene, which meant he'd understood something important about what she'd needed. You heard, she said. I heard, he said. I have it handled, she said. I know you do, he said. And then, how much are they trying to short you? $18, she said, in manufactured fees. His jaw tightened. Let me... No, she said. Firm. Immediate. He looked at her. Thomas, she said. I have this. I have handled everything they've thrown at me for 6 months on my own, and I'm not going to... She stopped, steadied her voice. I'm not going to start taking money from you now. That's not how I'm willing to do this. He was quiet for a moment. This isn't charity, he said. I was going to suggest I know a lawyer in Abilene who does property work and owes me a considerable favor. She stopped. An introduction, he said. That's all. What you do with it is your business. She looked at him for a long moment. A lawyer, she said. A good one, he said. William Hart. He's sharp, and he doesn't like mortgage manipulation, which this sounds like. She took a breath. An introduction, she said. That's all I'm offering, he said. She nodded, once. All right. He nodded back. He started to turn. Thomas, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said. For not. She gestured slightly at the space where Briggs had been. For letting me handle it. He looked at her steadily. You didn't need me to handle it, he said. You never have. He walked away. She stood with that sentence for a full minute. You never have. She thought about what it meant to have someone see that about you, not as a challenge or an inconvenience, but simply as a fact, simply as a thing that was true about who you were, with no expectation that you'd perform otherwise. She picked up her ladle and went back to the pot. The crew knew something had happened. Crews always knew. They had the particular sensitivity of people who spent months together in confined circumstances and had developed out of pure survival necessity. The ability to read shifts in the atmosphere of a camp the way Clara read weather in the quality of light. Nobody said anything directly, but Roy brought twice as much firewood that evening without commenting on it. Sam, the quiet drover who'd said yes ma'am after the last Greer situation, managed to position himself between her wagon and the rest of the camp for most of the afternoon in a way that looked casual and wasn't. Old Bill appeared at her elbow with a cup of coffee he'd made himself, which he had never done in the history of the drive, and set it down in front of her and said, Man on a horse came from the south today. He did, Clara said. Gone now, Bill said. He is, Clara said. Good, Bill said, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She stood with the coffee Bill had made, and she thought about what it meant to have earned this, not their pity, not their charity, Not the careful management of men who felt obligated, but this. The quiet, unsentimental solidarity of people who had watched her work for 2 months and had come in the way that people came to things when they weren't performing them to regard her. It sat differently than anything she'd been given in Harding. It sat like something she'd built with her own hands, which was the only way anything Clara Whitmore had ever built had felt real to her. On the 68th day, Walt Greer made his final mistake. She had thought after the last confrontation that he was done. That the combination of Thomas's instruction and her own responses, and the clear shift in how the rest of the crew regarded her, had finally added up to something he wasn't willing to push against anymore. She had thought that. She was wrong. It didn't happen the way the other times had happened. It didn't happen to her face, or even sideways in earshot. It happened in a way that was, she thought, more calculated than anything he'd done before. She found out because Roy told her. Roy came to her wagon in the evening with his jaw set in the way she'd come to recognize meant he was angry about something and had decided that being angry quietly was not in this instance sufficient. "Greer's been talking," Roy said, "to some of the men from the Dunmore Drive that came through this afternoon, telling them—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "Telling them about you and the boss, making it sound like—" He stopped again. "Like you've been earning something other than your wages on this drive." Clara was very still. "How many men heard it?" she said. 6 or 7 from their drive," Roy said. "2 of ours. Bill and Sam got the 2 of ours sorted out already. The others—" He shook his head. "They're strangers. They'll take the story wherever they go next." Clara thought about this for a moment. Thought about strangers carrying a story forward. Thought about the shape a lie took when it had legs and a direction and no one to correct it. "Where's Greer now?" she said. "Southfire," Roy said. She put down what she was holding. "Clara," Roy said, and there was a warning in it. "I'm not going to do anything foolish," she said. She walked to the Southfire. Greer was there with 2 of his own people, and he saw her coming from far enough away that he had time to arrange his face into the expression of a man who had been expecting this and had already decided how it was going to go. She stopped in front of him. "You want to explain to me," she said very quietly, "what you thought you were going to accomplish." Greer spread his hands. "I don't know what you're—" "Don't," she said. "Don't insult what little intelligence you've shown on this drive by pretending you don't know exactly what I'm talking about." He was quiet. "I have worked this drive for 68 days, she said. "I have worked it harder than you. I have worked it with more care than you. I have saved the food stores and nursed the injured men and kept the camp together through a stampede and a storm and a bad water crossing. And everything I have earned, every single thing I have earned with my hands and my back and my own effort. Nothing else." She paused. "You know that. Every man on this drive knows that. And you know they know it, which is why you had to go to strangers." Greer's face was doing something complicated. "And you want to know something else," she said. "It won't work. You know why it won't work. Because the men on this drive will say what's true. Because Thomas Caldwell will say what's true. And because she said, am going to say what's true to anyone who asks for as long as it takes, and I am not afraid of you or your story, or anything you can put in anyone's mouth." She turned to walk away. Greer said behind her, "Must be nice having the trail boss in your corner." She stopped. She turned back. "Thomas Caldwell is in my corner," she said, "because I am worth being in. Same as every person who has ever stood up for me on this drive. Not because of who I am to him, because of who I am." She let that sit. "The same way that you, Mr. Greer, are standing alone at this fire because of who you are." She looked at him one final time. "I hope the next drive treats you better than you've treated this one." She walked back to her wagon. Roy was waiting. She picked up her ladle. "Well," Roy said. "It's done," she said. "He's done." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know, when I came on this drive, I figured the cook would be an old man named something like Hank who burned the beans." "I'm sorry to disappoint," she said. "You're really not," he said. She smiled, kept cooking. Thomas dealt with Greer the following morning. She didn't witness it directly. She heard through the ordinary channels of a small camp, where everything eventually reached everyone, that Thomas had called Greer aside before the drive moved out, and that Greer had been given his wages through the previous day and told to find his own way to Abilene, and that the conversation had been brief. Thomas said nothing to her about it directly. He came to get his coffee and said, "Morning, Clara," and she said, "Morning, Thomas," and he drank it and went back to his horses. She stood with her own coffee and felt the absence of Greer in the camp, the way you felt a bad tooth once it was finally gone. Relief and a mild disbelief that you'd been managing the pain for so long without realizing how much of your attention it had been taking. The drive moved out. 6 days to Abilene. The last week of the drive had a quality she hadn't expected. She'd expected it to feel like a countdown, like the tightening of something, like all the things that had been suspended would begin falling at once as the endpoint got close. Instead, it felt like a long exhale. The men were lighter. Not less tired they were, if anything more tired, the accumulated weight of the whole journey settling into their bones, now that the end was real enough to feel, but lighter in spirit, in the way people got when the worst was behind them, and what remained was known and manageable. Thomas was lighter too. She could see it in small things, the way he sat at the evening fire, instead of standing at its edge, the way he contributed to conversations, instead of overseeing them. The way he laughed at something Roy said one evening, a full, unguarded laugh that she'd never heard from him before, that was so startling and so lovely that several nearby cowboys turned to look. He caught her looking. He didn't look away. She didn't either. Roy, pretending not to notice any of this, said something to old Bill in an undertone that made Bill's shoulders shake. She chose not to ask. On the fifth to last night, Thomas came to the wagon at the end of the evening and stood in a way that she'd come to read precisely. Hands out of his pockets. Weight balanced the posture of a man who'd made a decision and was done reconsidering it. "I'd like to talk to you," he said. "Then talk," she said. He sat down on the wagon step, which he'd never done before, and she sat beside him, because that was clearly what was called for, and the fire was low, and the camp was settling, and the night was warm and big. "I wrote 2 letters before we left Texas," he said. "One to Lily, one to Ethan." She waited. "In Ethan's letter," he said, "I told him I'd met someone on the drive. I told him she was a widow and she was strong, and she had more good sense than anyone I'd been around in years." He paused. "I told him I thought his mother would have liked her." Clara's breath caught slightly. "I didn't tell him I was going to ask her anything," Thomas continued, "because I didn't know yet if she'd have me." He looked at her. "I still don't know. But I've known what I wanted to ask since about the 35th day, and I've been waiting for Abilene because I thought Abilene was the right place, and I'm reconsidering that because 5 more days seems—" He stopped. "It seems like a long time to wait to say something true." She was very still. "So I'm going to say it here," he said. "Under whatever stars these are, in the middle of a cattle drive, 5 days from Kansas, which is not a romantic setting by any reasonable measure." "Thomas," she said. "Let me finish," he said. "Please." She closed her mouth. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the first morning, building the picture, intending to keep it. "I have a ranch in Montana with a kitchen window that faces east," he said. "I have 2 children who are growing up without their mother and doing the best they can with a father who loves them more than he's always known how to show. I have a cattle company that works hard and a life that works, and a house that's been missing something I didn't have a name for until I watched you stand down Walt Greer and make dinner in a rainstorm and tell me things I needed to hear in the exact way I needed to hear them." He paused. "I'm asking you to come to Montana, Clara, not as a cook, not as an employee, as my wife, if you'll have me." The fire snapped. The cattle settled in the dark. She thought about the farmhouse in Harding that she'd been fighting for, the $36, and the mortgage, and Harold Briggs, and Margaret Ellison, and everything she'd built her survival around for 6 months. She thought about Lily checking on her plants too often, afraid they'd disappear. She thought about a kitchen window facing east. She opened her mouth, and then a voice came from 20 feet away, in the particular carrying tone of a man who had not calculated the distance correctly. "Just say yes, ma'am, Lord above." Roy Penders. She turned to look. Roy was sitting with his back to them very deliberately looking at the sky, and Bill was beside him with an expression of profound peace. Thomas looked at Roy. Roy did not turn around. "I've been listening to this man work up to this conversation for 6 weeks," Roy said to the sky, "and I would very much like to go to sleep." Clara looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Clara, and she said, "Yes." Roy's shoulders dropped about 2 inches with relief. Old Bill said quietly to no one in particular, "Thank God." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, with the picture-building, picture-keeping look that she now understood had been cataloging her since the first morning assembling her from pieces until he had enough to know, and his expression was the most open she'd ever seen it. "Yes," she said again, quieter just for him. He took her hand, not briefly this time, not the half-second press of earlier. He held it properly, his fingers through hers, and she could feel the calluses from the reins and the weight of the drive in his hands. And she did not let herself think about what she was giving up or what she was stepping toward, because for once in her life, she was only in the moment she was in. Somewhere behind them, Roy said, "All right, Bill, you win the $1." Bill said, "Told you she'd say yes before Abilene," Thomas said without looking away from Clara. "Both of you go to sleep." They went to sleep. Clara sat with her hand in Thomas Caldwell's hand under the stars of the Texas plain, and she thought about Montana and a little girl named Lily, and a boy named Ethan who went silent when things were wrong, and a kitchen window that needed something growing in it. She thought about Rosemary. She thought about how it came back. She thought, "I am going to be someone's home," and after everything. After James and the grave and the farmhouse and the $36 and the trail and the storm and the stampede and Greer and Briggs and 6 months of surviving that thought, small and certain and completely without drama, was the one that finally gently broke her open. She did not cry. She had not cried since the morning they buried James, and she did not cry now, but it was close, and Thomas felt it in the slight change in her grip, and he held on a little tighter, and neither of them said anything at all. They sat until the fire went out completely. Then she said, "5 days to Abilene." "5 days," he said. "Plenty of time to change your mind," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was the complete answer to that sentence and required no additional words. She looked back at him. "Get some sleep, Thomas," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He didn't move for another 10 minutes. Neither did she. The last 5 days of the drive passed the way the first 5 had, relentlessly without sentiment, with the particular indifference that the trail had toward anything that was not the work itself. The cattle did not care that Thomas Caldwell had asked a woman to marry him under the Texas stars. The water crossings did not pause for it. The heat did not soften. The miles did not shorten. Clara cooked. Thomas rode. The herd moved north. But something had changed in the fabric of the drive, and everyone felt it without saying so directly, because this was a crew of cowboys, and cowboys did not say things like "the atmosphere of the camp feels different since the trail boss and the cook reached an understanding." What they said was things like Roy telling Danny Webb in a letter he was writing home that the rest of the drive had been real fine, and old Bill sleeping better than he had in 2 weeks, and Sam, the quiet drover, starting to whistle in the mornings, which he had not done since the Red River crossing. She noticed all of it. She noticed because she had always noticed, and because noticing was how she loved people. Not in grand gestures, not in declarations, but in the accumulation of small, accurate observations that said, "I see you. I see who you actually are, and I am not going anywhere." Thomas noticed her noticing. On the 4th to last morning, he rode past the wagon at a pace that had no trail business justifying it, and said without stopping, "You're doing that thing where you're cataloging everything." "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Yes, you do," he said, and kept riding. She watched him go with a feeling in her chest that had settled into something so steady and warm, she'd stopped trying to name it and just let it be there. 4 days, then 3, then 2. Abilene arrived, the way destinations arrived after long journeys, suddenly, despite having been expected, in a way that made it feel both inevitable and startling simultaneously. The sound of the city came before the sight of it, which was always how it worked on the trail, the particular noise of a cattle town at full operation, the stockyards and the commerce and the organized chaos of an industry receiving what the drives had carried for months. Thomas brought the herd in with the same competent, unshowy precision he'd managed every other challenge on the trail, and the sound that went up from the crew when the last steer passed through the stockyard gate was the real thing. This time, not the controlled exhale of a river crossing, but a full, unguarded shout of relief from 24 men who had been riding hard for 73 days and were finally genuinely done. Clara stood on the wagon seat and let it wash over her. She had done it. She had driven a chuck wagon from Harding, Texas to Abilene, Kansas, across 73 days of plains and storms and river crossings and a stampede, and she had fed 25 men every single day, and not one of them had gone hungry, and she was still standing. Roy Penders rode past the wagon and pulled his hat off and held it at his chest in a gesture that was not ironic at all, and said, "Cookie," with a gravity that made the nickname which she had spent the first 2 weeks resisting feel like the highest compliment she'd ever been paid. "Roy," she said. He put his hat back on and grinned and rode toward the stockyards. Old Bill appeared at her elbow, which was where he always appeared, as though he materialized rather than walked. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "You did good," he said. "We did good," she said. He looked at her. His weathered face was doing something she'd learned to translate as profound feeling expressed through the absolute minimum of visible movement. "You going to Montana?" he said. "I am," she said. He nodded, looked at the city, looked back at her. "Thomas Caldwell," he said in the tone of a man delivering a character reference, "is one of the finest men I have known in 40 years of cattle work. I have seen him make hard decisions and fair ones, and I have never once seen him be small. That's rarer than people think." Clara looked at him. "I know," she said. "Just wanted to say it," Bill said, "since I likely won't get another chance." She put her hand on his arm briefly. He allowed it, which from Bill was the equivalent of an embrace. "Take care of yourself, Bill," she said. "Always do," he said, and walked away toward the stockyards without looking back, because looking back was not a thing Bill did, and she'd have been surprised if he'd started now. The business of Abilene was immediate and consuming. The cattle sold at a price. Thomas described to the Caldwell Company representative who met them at the stockyards as adequate, with a tone that suggested he had opinions about what adequate should mean that the market had not fully honored. Clara watched him negotiate with the same focused, unhurried competence she'd watched him manage everything else, and she thought about how this was also who he was. Not just the trail, not just the quiet fires and the honest conversations, but this, the man who ran a cattle company and understood numbers and held his position under pressure from buyers who wanted to pay less than the work was worth. She found that she was not intimidated by this version of him. She found actually that she liked watching it. The crew received their wages in the afternoon. She received hers, $36, in a small envelope with Clara Whitmore written on the outside in Thomas's handwriting, which she recognized now, having seen it on the accounting ledgers he kept, and she held it for a moment with a feeling she could not entirely describe, the particular satisfaction of money that had been earned through something she'd chosen by her own will on her own terms. She had earned this, every single dollar of it. She put it in her dress pocket and went to find William Hart. Thomas's lawyer was a lean, sharp-eyed man of about 50, who operated out of a small office above a dry goods store, and who stood when she entered and did not look at her the way most men looked at her, which immediately placed him in her good estimation. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "Tom said you'd be coming." "He told you what I need," she said. "Mortgage dispute. Manufactured fees, deadline pressure applied on the trail." He picked up a pen. "Tell me the details." She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was finished, he made 3 notes and said, "The late fees as described are not standard under Texas mortgage law as written in 1882. They may be legal under a specific clause in your original agreement, but that clause would have required separate written notice to be enforceable, and I'd want to see whether that notice was ever given." He looked at her. "Did you receive written notice of the additional fee schedule?" She thought back. "No," she said. I received the mortgage agreement when we signed. After that, I received letters requesting payment. None of them specified a separate fee schedule. Hart smiled. It was a small, precise smile. Then we have something to work with. How much will this cost me? She said. Tom's handling my fee, Hart said. She started to object. He held up one hand. I owe that man 3 favors from a cattle dispute in '81 that I won't go into, he said. Consider it a long overdue debt being settled. Your $36 stays in your pocket, Mrs. Whitmore. She looked at him for a moment. I'll need to repay him, she said. That, Hart said, picking up his pen, seems like something between you and Tom. Now, the buyer's name, she told him. He wrote a letter in 20 minutes. That was, she thought, one of the most elegant and quietly devastating documents she had ever read, citing 3 specific statutes and requesting documentation of the written notice that had never been sent, and informing Mr. Harold Briggs and the bank holding the Whitmore mortgage that any sale of the property prior to the resolution of the fee dispute would constitute grounds for legal action. He sealed it. He handed it to her. This goes by telegraph to Fort Worth today, he said. You'll have a response before you leave Abilene. My guess is the manufactured fees disappear and your $36 covers what's legitimately owed. She took the envelope. Mr. Hart, she said. William, he said. William, she said. Thank you. Thank me when the deed's in your hand, he said. Come back tomorrow morning. She found Thomas at the hotel that served as the Caldwell Company's Abilene base, sitting at a table in the front room with paperwork spread in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. She sat down across from him. He looked up. Hart see you, he said. He did, she said. He's sending a letter today. He thinks the fees will disappear. They will, Thomas said. Briggs knows he's overextended and he won't want the exposure. She looked at him. You knew that before you sent me to Hart. I had a strong suspicion, he said. You could have told me that on the trail, she said, when I was shaking over the paper. He met her eyes. You were handling it, he said. You said so. I believed you. She held his gaze. I need to repay you for Hart's fee, she said. No, he said. Thomas. Clara, he said, and his voice was even and quiet. In approximately 6 weeks, if you're willing to travel at a reasonable pace, you'll be in Montana. At some point after that, we'll stand in front of whatever judge or minister is available and say the words, and after that, I'm going to need someone to help me figure out why nothing will grow in a kitchen window facing east. He paused. At that point, the question of who owes what to whom becomes considerably more complicated. I suggest we table it. She looked at him for a long moment. You are very difficult to argue with, she said. Yes, he said. I've been told that. She almost smiled. Who told you that? My sister Martha, he said. Every week for the last 20 years. She did smile then, and she watched him watch it happen, the same way he'd watched it in the camp on the last day with Greer, with that look that was building and keeping. 6 weeks, she said. Give or take, he said. There's a stage north from Dodge City that connects to the rail line. More comfortable than a wagon. I've been in a wagon for 73 days, she said. I think I can manage a stage. I imagine you can manage most things, he said. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to need to go back to Harding first, collect the deed, close up the house. Of course, he said. I'll come with you. She blinked. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, he said. I want to. She understood what he was saying. He was saying he wanted to stand beside her in Harding, Texas, where people had whispered about her and made their calculations and found her wanting, and he wanted to be visible there beside her, so that anyone who looked would see exactly what the woman they'd dismissed had become. She wanted to tell him he didn't need to do that. She also, if she was honest, wanted to let him. All right, she said. I went back to his paperwork. She drank his cold coffee because she wanted something to do with her hands, and he looked up and noted this and said nothing about it. And she thought about how comfortable this already was, this particular shape of being together, and how much she trusted it. The response from Fort Worth came the next morning as Hart had predicted. The manufactured fees had been waived. The outstanding balance was $31.40 less than her wages, which meant she would clear the mortgage with money left over, which meant the farmhouse was hers, free and clear for the first time since James had signed the papers. Hart handed her the telegram with a small, precise smile. She read it twice. "Deed will be registered in your name at the Fort Worth courthouse within 10 days, Hart said. You can pick up a certified copy in Harding." She looked at the telegram for a long moment. $31.40. She'd earned 36. She had $4.60 left over, which was not a fortune by any measure, and she was going to Montana anyway, so the house would need to be rented or sold or some arrangement made. But that was a practical problem, and practical problems were things she knew how to solve. The point was, it was hers. Nobody had given it to her. Nobody had rescued it for her. She had gone out onto the trail with her own hands and her own back, and she had earned the money, and she had kept the house, and nobody, not Harold Briggs, and not Margaret Ellison, and not any of the careful, cruel voices she'd been carrying in the back of her head for 6 months, could take that from her. "Thank you, William," she said. "Any time, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. And then with a slightly different inflection, "or whatever your name's going to be." She looked at him. He smiled again, less precisely this time, something that had warmth in it. "Tom's a transparent man when it matters. He told me." He paused. "He hasn't looked like that since before Helen died. I thought you should know that." She absorbed this. "Thank you," she said, quieter. "Go on," he said. "You've got a deed to collect and a trip to make." Joel. They left Abilene for Harding 2 days later. Just the two of them, which felt both natural and surreal. No crew, no herd, no drive, no function to be performed. Just Thomas and Clara, and a hired wagon, and the road south, and the long unstructured hours of a journey that had no purpose except arrival. She had not been alone with Thomas for any extended period. There had always been the drive around them. 24 men, the cattle, the noise, the work, the legitimate demands of the trail that gave every conversation a context and a limit. Now there was nothing except the road and the two of them. It was, she discovered, entirely comfortable. They talked, or they didn't. They fell in and out of silence the way people who were used to silence did, without the pressure to fill it, without the performance of ease. Thomas told her things about Montana she hadn't known, the winters which were serious, and the springs which were extraordinary. He told her about the Caldwell Ranch in detail, the buildings and the land, and the particular challenges of running cattle at altitude. She told him things about Harding. She hadn't told anyone the way the town had felt after James died, the specific quality of the loneliness, the way she'd had to rebuild herself from principles rather than feeling. Because feeling had gone somewhere she couldn't access. He listened, the way he listened to everything completely, with that attention that took in more than the words. On the second evening, stopped for the night on the road south, he asked her something she hadn't expected. "Were you happy," he said, "with James, before?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. "Yes," she said, briefly and genuinely and completely. "It wasn't a perfect marriage. We were very young and we had no money, and we argued about small things. But he was kind. He was genuinely kind, which I had not entirely expected to find." Thomas was quiet. "I didn't know what to do with kindness at first," she said. "I'd spent so long bracing for the other thing that kindness felt like a trick. I was patient about that." "He sounds like a good man," Thomas said. "He was," she said. "You would have liked him, I think." Thomas looked at her steadily. "I think so too," he said. And she loved him for that, for not flinching from it, for not making James into something that needed to be managed or minimized, for simply placing him where he belonged, which was in her history and her heart, and nowhere else, because the past was not competition with the present, unless you made it so. "Helen," she said carefully. "Tell me about Helen." He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. He told her about a woman who had been stubborn and funny and not easily impressed, who had made Thomas work for everything, and never let him get away with being less than his best self, who had been an extraordinary mother and a difficult person to argue with, and who had loved Montana in the summer the way most people loved something they'd chosen rather than been given. He told her about the last 3 weeks, which she had not asked about, but which he told her anyway, because it was still something he carried, and carrying alone had gotten heavier over time. She listened. When he was done, the fire had gone low, and neither of them spoke for a while, and that was exactly right. "She would think you were a fool," Clara said finally, "for not planting something in that window for 3 years." He made a sound that was entirely a laugh. "Yes," he said. "She absolutely would." "Good," Clara said. "Then we have something in common already." He looked at her. She looked at the fire. "Go to sleep, Thomas," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Harding was exactly as she'd left it. This surprised her somewhat irrationally. She had changed so completely in 3 months that some part of her expected the town to have changed as well. Out of basic courtesy, the world rearranging itself to match the person returning to it. It had not. The main street was the same. The dry goods store where Margaret Ellison held court was the same. The boardwalk where she'd been told with manufactured sympathy that James had married her out of generosity. Same boards, same posts, same sky above it. She walked down it with Thomas Caldwell at her side. He did not hold her hand. He did not make a production of being beside her. He simply walked with her in the easy, unhurried way he did everything, and his presence was simply a fact, quiet and certain, and immovable. She felt people noticing. She noticed them noticing. And she found to her genuine surprise that it had less power than she'd expected. Not no power. She would be lying if she said that Margaret Ellison's eyes on her as she walked past the dry goods store didn't create a familiar tightening in her chest. She would be lying if she said the whisper she caught at the edge of hearing something about the Whitmore widow didn't land somewhere it wasn't welcome. But it was smaller than it had been. It was smaller because she was not the same woman who had walked this boardwalk 6 months ago, and the measurement she was using to take its size was different now. She was measuring it against 73 days on the trail, against a stampede and a storm and a land agent and a lawyer's letter and $36 she'd earned with her own hands. And measured against all of that, Margaret Ellison's eyes were simply the eyes of a woman standing in a store. They stopped at the courthouse. The deed was waiting as Hart had promised. She signed 3 papers, and the clerk handed her a document, and she stood in the Harding County Courthouse with the deed to the farmhouse in her hands. Her name on it, hers free and clear, and she thought about everything it had cost, and everything it meant, and the fact that she was going to turn around and rent it to the Henderson family who'd been looking for a place since spring, and she was going to walk out of this courthouse and leave Harding, Texas, possibly forever, and none of that made the deed feel any less like what it was. A thing she had earned. A thing that was hers. Thomas stood slightly behind her, giving her the moment because he understood the geometry of what this was and what space she needed inside it. She folded the deed. She put it in her pocket next to the $4.60. She turned around. He was watching her. "Ready," he said. "Almost," she said. She went to Margaret Ellison's dry goods store. Thomas did not ask why. He followed which was the right response. Margaret was behind the counter, and she looked up when the door opened, and the specific quality of her expression, the way it moved from assessment to calculation to the arranged sympathy that was her default, was so familiar and so small that Clara almost felt something like pity. Almost. "Clara," Margaret said. "My goodness, we'd heard you were on a cattle drive." "I was," Clara said. "I'm back." Margaret's eyes moved to Thomas performing the calculation. "This is Thomas Caldwell," Clara said. "He owns the Caldwell Cattle Company out of Montana. He brought the drive in." Thomas touched his hat brim, said nothing. Margaret's eyes came back to Clara with a new quality in them, still calculating, but with less certainty now, as though the numbers weren't coming out the way they usually did. "We're going to Montana," Clara said. "I wanted to stop in before we left." "Going to Montana," Margaret repeated. As his wife, Clara said. Straightforward. Unapologetic. Not delivered with triumph. She'd made a decision before walking in here that she was not going to deliver this with triumph, because triumph required the other person's opinion to matter, and Margaret Ellison's opinion had already taken up more space in her life than it deserved. She was delivering it as a simple fact, which was what it was. Margaret's mouth opened and then closed. "I wanted to tell you myself," Clara said, "because you knew James, and because this town was my home for a long time, and because I believe in looking people in the eye." She paused. "I also wanted to pick up some rosemary seeds. You carry those?" Margaret blinked. Yes, I think so. In the seed section." "Good," Clara said, and walked to the seed section and found the rosemary and brought it to the counter and paid for it and said, "Thank you, Margaret," in the same tone she'd have used for anyone, and walked out. On the boardwalk, Thomas was quiet for exactly one step. Then he said, "Rosemary seeds." "For the kitchen window," she said. He was quiet for another step. "You are," he said, "the most extraordinary woman I have ever encountered." "I know," she said. He laughed. Fully the way he'd laughed that evening in camp with Roy, unguarded and real. She kept walking, but she was smiling. They left Harding the next morning, and they did not look back, and the road north felt entirely different from the road south had felt, which was the way of departure when you were heading towards something rather than away from it. The journey to Montana was long. Stage to Dodge City Rail, north and west. Another stage on the far side of the mountains, and then the last miles by wagon on the road. Thomas knew so well he could have driven it in the dark, and possibly had. She watched the land change, and she catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, and Thomas named things for her. The mountain ranges visible from particular high points on the road, the river systems, the territory markers, and she listened and filed it all away. She was learning a new place. She was learning it the way she'd learned the chuck wagon and the trail, and Thomas himself in pieces carefully, without rushing the understanding. On the last day of the journey, Thomas went quiet. Not the usual quiet, a different kind. The quiet of a man who was about to encounter something that mattered and was gathering himself for it. She let him be quiet. An hour later he said, "There." She looked. The ranch came into view as they crested a rise, and it was exactly what he'd described, and entirely its own thing in ways description couldn't capture. Wide, solid, settled into the land, with the particular permanence of something that had been built to last. 4 mountain ranges. She counted them. He'd been right about all of it. She felt something in her chest that was not nervousness exactly, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of a significant moment, as it was arriving before it had fully landed. "Lily and Ethan," she said. "Martha's had them," he said. "They're expecting us." He paused. "They're not expecting all of it. I wanted to tell them in person." She nodded. "Of course." A beat. "Thomas," she said. "I know," he said. "Children are not, they might need time. Whatever they feel is it's allowed. I'm not going to ask them to feel something they don't." "No," she said. "Neither am I." He looked at her. "I am not coming to Montana to replace Helen," she said. "I know that. I've known it since you told me about Lily checking on her plants. I know what this is and what it isn't." He held her gaze for a moment. "What is it?" he said quietly. "It's a beginning," she said. "A real one. The kind that's allowed to be slow and uncertain and honest." She paused. "The kind I know how to build." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I believe you." The wagon moved down the hill toward the ranch. Ethan saw them first. He was 10 years old and had his mother's temper and his father's tendency to go silent when things were wrong, and he came out of the house with the specific wariness of a child who has learned that new things arriving in his life are not automatically good things. He looked at his father. He looked at Clara. He said nothing. Thomas got down from the wagon and went to him, and Clara stayed where she was, because this was not hers to manage, and she understood that absolutely. She watched Thomas crouch down to Ethan's level, not talking, down talking, even the way a man talked to a person whose feelings he respected, regardless of their age, and she couldn't hear what he said, but she could see the shape of it, the patient honesty of it, and she saw Ethan's face go through several things in quick succession before settling into something that was not acceptance yet, but was not rejection either. It was waiting. He was willing to wait. That was enough. Lily came out of the house behind her brother, and she was 7 years old with her mother's hair and a quality of directness in her face that Clara recognized immediately, and she walked up to the wagon with no wariness at all, and looked at Clara with the uncomplicated assessment of a child who had not yet learned to make her curiosity polite. "Are you the one from the trail?" Lily said. "I am," Clara said. "Papa wrote about you," Lily said. "He said you ran into a stampede." "I did," Clara said. Lily considered this. "Were you scared?" "Yes," Clara said. "Very." "But you did it anyway." "Yes." Lily thought about this for a moment with the gravity of someone weighing important information. "I fell off my horse last spring," she said, "and I got back on even though I was scared." "That's harder than a stampede," Clara said. Lily looked at her. "No, it isn't. You had to decide to get back on something that had already thrown you," Clara said. "I only had to decide to run toward something I'd never done before. Running toward something new is easier. Getting back on after you've been hurt, that takes real courage." Lily was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to stay?" Clara looked at her. At this small direct child with her mother's hair and her father's careful attention who checked on her plants too often because she was afraid things would disappear. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm going to stay." Lily looked at her for one long moment. Then she said, "Can you cook?" Clara felt something break open in her chest. "That," she said, "is what I'm known for." Lily held out her hand. Clara took it. The first meal she made in the Caldwell Ranch kitchen was not elaborate. It was soup, plain and honest, the same thing she'd made in a rainstorm for 25 men who'd been riding in the dark, because she understood that food was not about complexity. It was about presence, about someone deciding that the people in front of them were worth the effort of warmth. Ethan ate without speaking. Lily ate with the focused attention of someone taking something seriously. Martha Thomas's sister, who was a compact, sharp-eyed woman, who had looked at Clara on arrival with the specific appraisal of someone who had been waiting to make up her mind about her and had not quite done so, yet ate the soup and then ate more of the soup and said, "The cornbread is good," which from the quality of her face was the equivalent of a lengthy tribute. Thomas ate and looked at his children and then at Clara, and did not say anything at all, which said everything. After supper, while Lily was telling Clara about the plants she'd been trying to grow, and why they kept dying with a detailed forensic analysis that suggested she was going to be either a scientist or a lawyer, Ethan came to stand in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment. Clara looked at him. "Papa said you saved his life," Ethan said. "I helped," she said. "He said you ran into the stampede by yourself with just a whip," Ethan said. "That's accurate," she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He had the particular quality of a boy deciding something and wanting to be sure about it before he committed. "My mama was brave too," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Your father told me. She sounds like someone I would have admired." Ethan looked at her. "You're different than I thought you'd be." "What did you think I'd be?" He considered. "I thought you'd try too hard," he said, "to make us like you." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to try to make you like me, Ethan. I'm going to try to be worth knowing. That's a different thing. The first one is about me. The second one is about you." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Okay," in the particular tone of a 10-year-old who has decided something and is not going to perform any more emotion about it than that. He went to bed. Clara stood in the kitchen and let out a breath she'd been holding since the wagon came over the rise. Thomas appeared in the doorway where Ethan had been. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "Ethan talked to you." "He did." Thomas waited. "He's going to be fine," she said. "He needs time and honesty and someone who doesn't pretend this is simple. None of those things are things I can't give him." Thomas looked at her steadily. "And Lily," he said. "She hasn't let go of your hand since supper." "Lily," Clara said, "wants to know why her plants keep dying. We're going to fix that. Is that what you two were talking about for 45 minutes?" That and other things, she said. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and his hands came up to frame her face, and he looked at her with everything, all of it. The drive and the trail and the coffee before sunrise, and the stampede, and the hand held in the dark, and the yes she'd said under the Texas stars. And she looked back at him with all of it too, because there was no longer any reason not to, because she was here, and this was real, and she had made her choice with her eyes open, and she was not afraid. Clara Whitmore, he said. Thomas Caldwell, she said. He kissed her, and Lily from the hallway said in a stage whisper to Ethan, I told you. And Ethan said with great dignity, Go to bed, Lily. And Lily went to bed, and the kitchen was quiet, and outside the window facing east, the Montana night was enormous and full of stars. She planted the rosemary the next morning. Lily helped with the fierce, over-attentive focus she brought to all growing things, and Clara showed her how deep the roots needed to go, and how much space they needed, and why giving a plant what it needed was more important than checking on it every hour. But how do you know it's growing if you don't check? Lily said. You trust it, Clara said. You give it what it needs, and you trust that it knows how to do the rest. Lily looked at the planted rosemary with the expression of someone trying very hard to accept something that went against her nature. What if it dies? She said. Then we plant more, Clara said. That's the thing about rosemary. You can always plant more, and the more you plant, the better you get at knowing what it needs. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Will you teach me? Everything I know, Clara said. Lily nodded gravely, as though this was a contract being signed. Thomas, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway watching, turned away before either of them saw his expression, which was the expression of a man who had been carrying a house that was empty in all the ways that mattered, and had just felt it quietly, and without ceremony, begin to fill. The woman who arrived in Montana was not the woman who had stood before Warren Dodd in Harding, Texas and said, I need this job. She was made of the same material, the same stubbornness, the same practical intelligence, the same refusal to be ashamed of who she was, but she had been through something, and what she'd been through had not broken her, or diminished her, or made her into someone new. It had made her more completely herself. That was what the trail had done, and what Thomas had seen when he looked at her, and what the men of the drive had recognized in the way they brought firewood, and ate more soup, and said yes ma'am to an empty space where her last words had been. Not something new, something true. And here in a kitchen in Montana, with rosemary planted outside the east-facing window, and a little girl learning to trust what she'd planted, and a quiet boy deciding she was worth knowing, and a man who had found her in the middle of everything she'd thought was lost. Here was where the trail had always been going. Not to Abilene, not to a deed or a wage or a victory over people who had been small to her. Here, to this kitchen, to these children, to this man, to a life she had not planned and could not have imagined and had earned with everything she had on her own terms, in her own way, one honest day at a time. Clara Whitmore had gone out onto the trail to survive. She had come home to live. And the difference between those two things, that was everything. That was the whole story. That was what love, real love, the kind that didn't ask you to be smaller or quieter or easier, the kind that saw you clearly and chose you anyway and stood beside you when it mattered. That was what it gave you. Not rescue, not completion. Simply this someone to stand next to while you became who you already were. And that in the end was more than enough. That was everything.